Hello everyone, I'm the DreamTeller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember feeling that sudden drop in my stomach the first time I laid eyes on the old well. I wasn't looking for hidden places, and I sure wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But that day, during my hike on a little-known trail, I found something that shifted everything. It was just an old stone well covered in damp moss. It looked unused, maybe forgotten, but it drew me in like it had some kind of pull. I'm not sure why, but the second I saw it, I felt like there was a chill in the air, even though the sun was still high. I walked closer, and I noticed how quiet the forest got around me. I moved right up to the edge, brushing some of the moss away with my palm. The stones felt slick under my fingertips. I wasn't thinking about anything but how deep it might be. I grabbed a small pebble from the ground and dropped it inside. I listened for an echo. Instead of a normal echo, I heard a weird, muffled moan. It didn't sound like an animal. It was more like a person in pain, or maybe someone whispering in a low voice. I froze. My mouth went dry and my eyes darted around, but there was no one else near me. I took a step back and glanced into the well. I couldn't see the bottom. The darkness was thick. I leaned forward, carefully, but the only thing I noticed was a strange smell, like stale water and old mud. I got out of there in a hurry. I walked back along the trail, trying to act normal, but my hands were shaking. My mind kept replaying that moan. At first, I wondered if it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired, but I could still hear it in my head. That night, I struggled to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that well, dark and silent. Then, in the middle of the night, I dreamt I was walking through an underground corridor. The walls were wet and dripping. My feet splashed through shallow water. I could see a faint light in front of me and I followed it, but I never got any closer to the source. All I could hear was the sound of water trickling down stone and my own unsteady breathing. I woke up covered in sweat, my heart pounding. The next day I went back to the same spot. Part of me wanted to brush it off as some weird experience and move on, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. The path was quiet again, almost too quiet, with only a few birds and a soft breeze. When I reached the well, nothing happened at first. I stood there, looking at the rocks and the moss. The air smelled damp even though the day was warm. This time I called out, "Hello?" No answer, just a faint echo. I waited, leaning on the edge for a few seconds. Then I thought I heard a whisper. It sounded like my name, but very faint and dragged out. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step backward, my shoes sliding on the dirt. I felt my chest tighten, and my pulse hammered in my ears. I left again, feeling even more uneasy. I decided to do some digging around the local area. It's not a popular place, so there aren't a lot of people to ask. There's a small diner on the side of the main road, though. The owner is a guy named Martin, and he's always there, wiping counters and talking about local fishing spots. I asked him if he knew anything about an old well in the woods behind the ridge. He paused, looked at me with a stiff expression, and said he'd heard some stories. He told me that folks around here avoided it. Some claimed they had heard voices calling them from the bottom. A few said the voices used their actual names, like the well knew who they were. Martin didn't say much more. He looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather change the subject. That night I tried to sleep again, but the same dream came back. This time the corridor felt longer and the water was deeper. I could feel it soaking into my socks. The walls were narrower and I had to keep my arms tucked in as I walked. My flashlight flickered and I smelled mold. I tried to look back, but I couldn't see anything behind me. All I heard was a slow, heavy drip. I forced myself awake, gasping for air. My sheets were soaked in sweat. My heart was racing, and I couldn't slow it down for a while. I got up and drank some water. My hands were trembling against the glass. By the third day, I decided I needed to know more. I asked around another place near the forest, an old gas station, where the attendant, a middle-aged guy with a tired face, just shrugged and said something like, "Don't mess with that. People come back spooked. Some claim the well calls their name." I felt a chill on the back of my neck. That lined up with what I heard. I tried to ask if anyone ever went down there, but he just shook his head and said, "Not that I know of." I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that the well was there, waiting. My dreams wouldn't stop. Every night I was back in that underground passage. Sometimes the water was up to my ankles. Other times it was up to my knees. I never saw the end of that corridor. I just kept hearing something breathing in the darkness, like a steady rasp that got closer with each step. When I woke, my body was covered in cold sweat, and my throat was dry. I was losing sleep fast, and it started to affect my mood. I felt irritable. I jumped at small sounds. On the 5th day after I first discovered the well, I returned in the early morning. I brought a flashlight, some rope, and a few basic tools. I'm not sure what I planned to do. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation. The forest was damp with morning dew, and the leaves glistened under the pale sunlight. Everything smelled fresh, except around the well. That same stale, musty odor lingered. When I shined my flashlight inside, I saw the interior walls were lined with slick stones. The light hit the water at the bottom, which looked murky. I couldn't tell how deep it was. I tied the rope to a nearby tree just in case. My palms were clammy and my mouth felt dry again. I swung the rope into the well, letting it dangle. The stone rim was solid, and I leaned forward to see if I could catch a better glimpse. I yelled down, "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed softly, and for a second everything was quiet. Then I heard a faint moan. It was the same muffled sound as before. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my temples. I forced myself to stay calm and pointed the flashlight straight down. I could see the light reflecting off the water. There was a slight ripple. It looked like something was moving underneath, but the water was too murky to show anything clearly. I got this intense knot in my stomach. My instincts told me to leave it alone, but a part of me wanted to go further. The thought of climbing down there made me sweat. My arms felt weak just imagining it. I tugged on the rope, testing its strength, but I never actually started the descent. I just stood there, heart pounding, and kept shining the flashlight. After a few minutes of that, I couldn't handle the tension anymore. I pulled the rope back up, untied it, and walked away. As soon as I got back to my car, I sat there for a while trying to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I felt like something was following me, even though I didn't see anyone. The next night, the dream was worse. The corridor's water was now up to my waist. I felt slimy things brushing against my legs. I kept hearing that same moan echoing through the darkness, and I sensed something at the far end, waiting. When I woke up, I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I decided to look deeper into local records. There was a small county office with a few dusty files about the area. I found a reference to an older structure labeled as a well, built decades ago. There was a note about it being sealed once, but the file didn't explain why. It just mentioned some local rumors of voices and illusions. I couldn't find anything else. It seemed like everyone just wanted to forget about it. I asked the clerk if she knew anything, and she shrugged, saying it was just a weird old story that people around here didn't like to discuss. For the next few days, I felt torn. The well stayed on my mind all day. At night, I dreaded sleeping, but the exhaustion caught up with me, and every time I slept, I had that same nightmare. Each time I went deeper into the corridor. Each time I felt more water around my body. In one dream, I even heard my own name spoken in a rough whisper. I woke up shouting, my hair plastered to my forehead with sweat. My heart pounded so fast I felt lightheaded. I finally told myself I had to make a choice. Either I give in to whatever that thing was, or I seal it up for good. I went back to the diner to talk to Martin. I explained what I'd been going through. He looked at me like he'd heard it all before. He set down the rag he was holding and said, "Look, if you think you can close that place off, do it. Some tried before. but they never finish the job. The stones keep shifting, and the water underneath always pushes back. Nobody really knows what's in there. Folks just stay away. I bought several bags of cement mix, a shovel, and a sturdy tarp. I drove out to the well in the late afternoon. I parked my car on the side of the old dirt road and hauled the supplies over. The forest was still and quiet. The sun was lower, casting long shadows. Every step I took felt heavy. My muscles ached from the stress and the lack of sleep. I got to the well and stood there, breathing hard. My eyes locked on the dark opening. The smell of damp stone clung to the air. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I started by mixing cement in a small bucket. My plan was to fill in the top portion of the well, maybe block it with rocks, then seal it with cement. As I worked, I kept expecting to hear something from the well. For a long while, it was quiet. The sun kept dropping, and the shadows stretched over the clearing. My nerves were on edge. Every rustle in the bushes made me jerk my head. My hands were coated in cement mix and sweat. Once the mixture was ready, I began dropping small rocks into the well. They made soft splashes. Occasionally, I heard a faint ripple afterward, like something was moving the water below. I poured in the first batch of cement, letting it trickle down the inside of the well, hoping it would start to form a base. My arms trembled from the physical effort. Then I heard it again. That moan. It was louder this time, and it sounded closer. My chest tightened, and I almost dropped the bucket. I forced myself to keep going. I poured more cement, then more rocks. I tried not to listen. I felt goosebumps all over my arms. The moan turned into a faint whisper. It sounded like it was right at the bottom of the well, just beyond my flashlight's reach. My name was in that whisper. I stopped and took a step back. My breathing was ragged, and I wiped my forehead with my sleeve, leaving a streak of cement. I thought about climbing down to see what it was, but my gut told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I grabbed the tarp and wedged it under the stones around the edge. Then I poured more cement over the top, hoping it would harden and keep the tarp in place. I worked fast. My shoulders ached, and my neck stiffened from tension. The sky was darkening. The flashlight beam felt weak. I kept hearing the water stirring. I heard occasional wet sounds like something dragging on the stone walls. My hands started shaking harder. I wanted to run, but I also didn't want to leave it half-finished. I kept piling debris on top of the tarp, adding more layers of cement. I packed it down with the shovel. My breath was coming in short bursts. Finally, when I used the last of the cement, I smoothed it over the makeshift cover. I stepped away, staring at the result. It didn't look professional, but it covered the opening. There was no obvious gap. I touched it carefully with my foot. The tarp and the rocks seemed solid enough, at least for the moment. I waited, listening for any sound. The forest was dead quiet, not a single breeze. I let out a long breath. My legs felt like jelly. My shirt was damp with sweat, and my hands were caked with cement residue. I stood there until the last bit of daylight vanished. I realized I was shaking, partly from the chill and partly from raw nerves. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was done. Whatever was in there was blocked off, at least for now. I walked back to my car in the dark, using my flashlight to avoid tripping over roots. My ears strained to catch any sign of movement behind me. The trees looked like tall silhouettes. My car was right where I left it. I threw my tools into the trunk and got in. My body felt exhausted, like I'd been in a fight. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back. That night, I waited for the dream. I stayed awake for hours, just sitting on my couch, the TV on mute. Eventually, sleep caught me. I found myself at the entrance to that same corridor. I could smell the stale water, but this time, I didn't hear the moan. I stood there, not moving. After a moment, everything just faded to black. When I woke up, it was morning. My sheets were dry and my heart rate was normal. My entire body felt sore, but I felt some relief. There was no corridor, no deep water, no voice calling my name. I don't know if the well will stay sealed. If the water rises or the ground shifts, that tarp and cement might break. But I did what I could. I haven't gone back to check and I don't plan to. Even thinking about it raises the hairs on the back of my neck. I haven't heard the voice in my dreams since that night. I keep telling myself it's over. The nightmares might return if the well opens again. But I won't be the one to set foot there again. I made my choice. I can only hope it stays buried. I still remember the package resting on my doorstep. It was wrapped in thick brown paper and secured with plain twine. My name was scribbled on the top in a shaky handwriting. I had no idea who sent it. I didn't recognize the return address. It just said the name of a distant relative I'd barely heard of. I felt a strange pulse of curiosity as I lifted it. It felt lighter than it looked. I brought it inside without thinking too much about it. When I sat down in my living room, I tore off the paper. Inside, I found an old wooden box with a hinged lid. The wood was scratched, and it had a stale smell like it had been buried in a basement for years. I opened the lid and saw a radio inside. It looked like something from the 1940s. It had chunky knobs, a curved handle on top, and a short antenna that was bent. There was a small envelope tucked into one corner. I flipped the radio over and found a handwritten sticker with my relative's name. Underneath that it said, "Property of the true listener." That phrase made me pause. I set the radio down, opened the envelope, and pulled out a single note that read, "Take care of this. It hears more than music." I felt an uneasy twinge in my stomach, but I dismissed it. I plugged the radio into the wall just to see if it worked. At first, there was nothing but a faint hum. The radio's dial didn't match modern stations, so I fiddled with the big knob trying to find some clarity. Nothing came through, just bursts of static. It didn't surprise me. It was a relic. I turned it off and went to bed, figuring I would look into it more the next day. That night I woke up around 3 in the morning, feeling a dull ache in my chest. It wasn't sharp, just a heavy pressure. I wasn't sure why I woke up. I listened for any noise, wondering if something fell in the kitchen or if a car alarm was going off. Everything was silent. Then I heard a crackle from the living room. I got out of bed, rubbed my eyes, and walked toward that sound. It was coming from the radio. It was on, even though I remembered switching it off. I stood there in the dark, staring at the radio's old dial glowing a weak green. It made an odd, metallic whispering sound, like a person mumbling through a tin can. My heart pounded. I reached out and turned the power knob, but it was already at the off position. That didn't make sense. I picked up the radio and turned it around to see if there was some other switch. There wasn't. I set it down again. That was when I heard it say my name, clear as day, but in a scratchy, uneven voice. "Daniel." That's all it said. I didn't even breathe. I felt my skin prickle, and my hands got clammy. I stood there staring at that radio for at least a minute, waiting for something else. Nothing came. I twisted the knob again, and the glow disappeared. The static cut out. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. In the morning, I thought I might have dreamed the whole thing. I felt stupid for losing sleep over it. Still, I was too uneasy to leave it alone, so I tried to see if maybe it was just a random station. I powered it on. This time, all I got was static. But as I turned the tuning knob, I noticed something strange. The furniture around me, my chair, the bookshelf, even my lamp, began to shake, very lightly. I heard a faint rattle like the vibration you get from a subwoofer, but there was no actual low bass sound. It was more like a vibration I felt in my bones. I switched the radio off and the shaking stopped. My arms felt shaky too, but in a different way, like I'd just realized something was very wrong. I looked around the house, trying to see if something else might be causing that vibration, but everything else was silent. No trucks outside, no helicopters overhead, no construction in the area. I flipped the radio back on to test it again. The shaking returned. The dial pointer moved smoothly under my fingers, but the static remained. After a moment, I heard short bursts of words. They were cut off, like half sentences. I strained to understand them. "This," Not safe, then more static. In the dark, opening, no time. My heart hammered. I leaned in, trying to catch another fragment, but it was just fuzzy noise. My name didn't come through again, but I felt singled out somehow. I looked for more clues in the wooden box. There were some folded pieces of paper at the bottom. The top page had a list of frequencies in pencil. Beside each one, there were notes like contact or response. I saw a date from decades ago. Below that, there were short lines. Voices identified, energy spikes, keep mind calm. I flipped through the pages. One page mentioned, they feed on mental signals. That made my pulse quicken. I didn't like the idea of anything feeding on me, especially not through a radio. Another page said, maintain open channel at your own risk. I slammed the box shut, feeling a surge of dread. That heaviness in my chest came back. I spent most of the day debating whether to throw the radio away. Something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity or some twisted fascination. I decided to keep it unplugged and shoved it into the coat closet. I tried to carry on with my day. I attempted to work on my computer, watch some TV, and cook dinner. Around 8 in the evening, I heard a soft thump from the closet. I approached it cautiously. My ears felt hot. My hands tingled. I grabbed the doorknob and pulled it open. The radio was on. It was glowing again, even though I'd unplugged it. I picked it up and it felt cold. Not room temperature cold, but like icy metal. My fingertips felt numb for a second. Static crackled. Then I heard a faint voice again. It wasn't speaking clearly. It was making strange clicks and buzzes like it was trying to form words. I wanted to smash it on the floor, but I couldn't move. I just stood there. Then I heard the radio say something that sounded like, help. It was so soft that I almost doubted I heard it at all. I heard my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My breathing was shallow. I forced myself to breathe in deeper. I couldn't stay frozen. I set the radio on the couch, sat across from it, and stared. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I remembered the notes. They feed on mental signals. I started thinking that maybe these voices, or whatever they were poking at my mind. That sensation of heaviness in my chest became more intense. My heart fluttered in a weird pattern, like it was skipping beats. The voice fell silent for a few seconds, replaced by a slow, pulsing static. Then it said, Daniel, open the gate. We see you. My stomach twisted. I felt like I might throw up. I got up and pulled the plug from the wall again, even though I knew it didn't matter. The radio went silent. I needed some fresh air. I walked outside, leaving the radio behind. It was a clear night. I stared up, expecting to feel calm. I didn't. I felt on edge, like I was being watched. My neck was stiff. I couldn't shake the tension in my body. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. I wanted to read more of my relative's notes. Maybe there was a way to break this connection. The papers said the radio was a portal. Apparently, he had spent years trying to tune into signals from beyond. He believed he made contact with entities that needed a host mind to latch onto. He claimed these entities traveled through certain frequencies no one could hear unless they had the right equipment. The notes mentioned bizarre experiments. He wrote about hearing his name through the static, about feeling drained, about objects vibrating. He warned that once the contact had been established, it was almost impossible to sever the link. I felt a wave of panic. I kept reading. The last entry said, I can't close it alone. I need someone else to hold the line. I have to pass it on. My hands started shaking so badly that I could barely read. I shoved the notes back in the box. I marched over to the radio, wrapped it in a towel, and stuffed it into a large plastic bin in my storage room. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I called a friend, just to hear a normal voice. I told him I was dealing with some weird old family item. Nothing more. I tried to distract myself, but my mind was stuck on that radio. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay there tossing and turning. Around 2 in the morning, the lights in my hallway flickered. I heard that low hum coming from behind my bedroom door. I cursed under my breath. My body felt stiff. My legs felt like concrete. I forced myself to get up. My skin crawled with goosebumps. I opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark. I saw the glow from the storage room. I heard a faint rattling noise. I didn't want to go in there, but I knew ignoring it wouldn't solve anything. The bin was shaking. The lid was vibrating like there was a strong current running through the plastic. I could hear that static again. This time it was more rhythmic, like a steady pulse. I yanked the bin open. The towel was moving, shifting around the radio. I reached in, grabbed the radio, and felt that freezing cold metal again. The static changed to soft mumbling. I felt all the hair on my arm stand up. I moved it to the floor and sat down next to it, swallowing the lump in my throat. I turned the dial slowly, trying to see if I could get the words to make sense. The static rose and fell. I caught fragments. Open mind. We cross. Energy is near. Hungry. My chest felt tight and I clenched my teeth. I tried to speak. I said, "What do you want?" My voice shook. I waited. Static. Then I heard, "Need your thoughts?" My breathing sped up. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I remembered the notes. They feed on mental signals. They lure curious people. I didn't want to be a conduit for anything. I turned the dial again, trying to find the end of that weird frequency range. The radio squealed. The objects on the shelves around me trembled. I felt a weird pressure in my head, like something pushing. My vision blurred for a second. I blinked hard. Then I heard a rising shriek in the speaker, followed by silence. My entire body felt like it was buzzing with leftover adrenaline. I set the radio aside and stood up. My legs wobbled. I felt drained, like I hadn't eaten in hours. I left the storage room, leaving the radio behind. My hands were slick with sweat. I splashed water on my face in the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I saw dark rings around my eyes. I didn't look like me. My mind was racing. I thought about destroying it, but I remembered the line in the notes. Maintain open channel at your own risk. That implied there was a way to close the channel, but I didn't see instructions on how. My relative must have known something. I went back to the notes. One page mentioned a method. Disconnect all power. Enclose the radio in a sealed space. Focus your intent on breaking the link. It sounded like nonsense, but I wanted to try anything. I found an old metal chest in my garage. I tested it with a flashlight. It had no cracks. It was heavy, but I dragged it into the storage room. I wrapped the radio in layers of cloth and put it inside the chest. I locked it. Then I stepped back and listened. Silence at last. For a few minutes I stood there waiting for the chest to shake. It stayed still. My heart rate gradually slowed down. I wiped my forehead. Then I remembered the note said something about focusing my intent. I felt silly, but I placed one hand on the chest, closed my eyes, and thought about severing any connection. I whispered, "You are not welcome. You cannot feed here." My voice cracked, but I repeated it a few times. The chest stayed still. My stomach unclenched a bit. I stood up and made my way to the kitchen. I wanted a glass of water. My throat was sore. I was sweaty all over. After I drank, I felt a small rush of relief. I realized how tense I'd been for the past few days. I didn't hear any static. I didn't feel that weird vibration. Part of me worried that it was just a temporary break, that the radio would power itself on again and call my name. But for the moment, it was quiet. I sat at the table, thinking about the fact that I had inherited this thing from someone who must have gone through the same torment. I pictured him alone with that radio, desperately wanting answers from beyond, and then getting trapped by those presences. He passed it on to me, probably hoping I could finish whatever he started or at least get it out of his hands. I felt angry at him, but also pity. Maybe he'd hoped I'd figure out a permanent solution. As the night wore on, I went back to check on the chest. It was still there, unchanged. No sound, no glow, no trembling. I left it locked. I decided I would store it in my garage for now. Maybe I'd figure out a way to dispose of it later. I have no intention of plugging it in again. I don't want to hear those voices. I don't want to sense that pressure in my head or feel my furniture shake. I'm done. I hope they can't reach me if it stays locked away. I haven't heard my name whispered since. I don't feel that icy cold presence either. I feel tired but calmer. I still wonder if I've really closed the channel. The radio is still in my garage, inside that metal chest. I'm leaving it there. Every now and then I catch myself listening for a hum or a faint knock at the door. But so far there's nothing. Maybe I managed to starve them out. Maybe they're waiting for a better moment to reach me again. I don't know. All I know is that I want no part of it. If anyone asks about my weird old radio, I just shrug and change the subject. I'm not letting that thing feed on me again. If it tries, I'll lock it up even tighter. That's the only plan I have. I still remember the first time I saw that figure in the locker room mirror. I had finished my workout and felt a little dizzy. My shirt was soaked, and I just wanted to rinse off. When I went to the mirror over the sink, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, reflected behind me, there was someone standing still, facing me. I froze. My heart pounded and my mouth dried up. But when I turned around, nobody was there. The tiled wall was empty. There was no one else in the locker room. I felt my stomach knot. I tried to tell myself it was my tired eyes playing tricks. I showered quickly, got dressed, and left. I tried not to think too hard about it. The next day, though, I noticed the same thing. After I left the weight area and headed to the locker room, I glanced at the long wall of mirrors by the water fountains. My reflection looked normal, but there was something odd in the background. It was like a figure standing far behind me. I spun around. Nothing. A smooth, empty hallway. I made a joke in my head, telling myself I should check my pulse or get more sleep. But I felt my legs tense up. My chest tightened. I felt silly for being nervous in public, so I moved on. I tried to ignore the whole situation, but it kept happening. At home the next morning, I went to wash my face in the bathroom. I happened to glance in the mirror before turning on the water. The figure was behind me again, almost pressed into the far corner of the reflection. My hands shook, and I gripped the edge of the sink so I wouldn't fall. The image lingered there. I didn't want to turn around, but I did. I forced my eyes up to see if someone was in my bathroom. Nobody was there. My shower curtain was closed. I grabbed it and pulled it back in one motion. The tub was empty. My face was burning. My breath came out in short bursts. Then I looked again at the mirror. The figure was gone. I tried to calm down. I had to get to work. I left my house and walked to the elevator in my apartment building. The elevator has those reflective walls that show every angle of whoever's inside. I got in alone. Once the doors slid shut, I saw my own reflection. Then I saw the figure behind me near the corner of the elevator. I nearly dropped my phone. I slammed the door open button, but I was so shaky that my finger slipped. By the time I finally got the doors open and spun around, there was no one behind me. The elevator was empty, as it should be. My breathing went ragged, and I felt a tingling in my arms. I got out of there. I took the stairs instead, but I still felt jumpy. My mind kept looping back to that reflection. I asked myself what it could be. I didn't have an answer. I decided to go about my day. I tried focusing on work, but it was useless. Every time I saw a glass window or a reflection on a computer screen, I twitched, expecting to see that figure. By the end of my shift, I was mentally drained. The next morning, I went to the gym again. I didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself that working out would clear my head. After my session, I went to the locker room to change. I stood at one of the big mirrors, trying not to look too closely. But I had to see if that thing was there. Sure enough, out of the corner of my vision, I spotted something in the reflection. The figure was closer this time. It wasn't in the far corner of the room. It was only a few feet behind me. I couldn't make out every detail, but I saw it clearly enough to sense it was a man. He had dark hair and stood with his shoulders squared. I felt a cold pressure around my chest. My eyes darted back to my real surroundings. The locker room was empty except for one guy at the far end, busy with his earbuds on, not paying attention. I wanted to leave right away, but I also felt curious. I stepped away from the mirror, turned around, and walked to the spot where the reflection had shown the figure. There was nothing, just the row of gray lockers and a bench. I walked back to the mirror and looked again. This time, it was gone. I left the gym without showering, which was gross, but I didn't care. I felt a crawling sensation on my neck, like someone was behind me. It didn't go away until I got home. Once I was in my apartment, I kept the lights on. I avoided any reflective surface. I didn't look at my TV screen when it was turned off. I didn't open the bathroom mirror cabinet. I just wanted to relax. But I had to make dinner, and the glass oven door and the window above the sink could still reflect things. So I kept my eyes straight ahead and tried to focus on preparing food. My arms were tense. I felt sweat gathering under my shirt. That night I hardly slept. I kept thinking that if I opened my eyes and looked at my phone screen or something reflective, I'd see him. I dozed off at some point, but I woke up with a jolt around 3 a.m. My heart was racing. I felt cold sweat on my forehead. It was like a nightmare, but I couldn't remember the details. I stayed in bed, forcing myself to keep calm. The next day, I debated skipping the gym. But I didn't want to give up on the routine I'd just started. My doctor told me exercise was key for my health. So I went, feeling uneasy. I tried not to look at any mirrors, but that's difficult in a gym full of them. I did my best to face away from them. I stayed focused on free weights and avoided the machines with reflective metal. When it was time to leave, I realized I needed to change. I went into the locker room, trying to keep my eyes forward. I went to my locker, but I slipped up. As I reached for my stuff, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the locker door. My face was pale. The figure was there again, right behind me. I swear I felt something like breath on my neck, though that might have been my imagination. I snapped my head around, empty, just me in a row of lockers. But in the reflection, his face looked almost visible. I couldn't see details, but he had a firm expression, as if he was waiting. My lungs felt tight. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I grabbed my gym bag and left without changing out of my workout clothes. I went straight home. I locked my door. I put down my bag and took a deep breath. Then I turned on every light. I shut all the curtains. I avoided my reflection in the living room window. My mind raced. I felt a pounding in my temples. Something was following me in my reflections, and I had no idea why. My legs felt weak, so I sank onto my couch. I put my head in my hands. I didn't want to call anyone because I wasn't sure how to explain it. Who would believe me? I spent the rest of that day trying not to look at anything shiny. At one point, I got hungry and opened the fridge. I caught the reflection of my face in the stainless steel door. Nobody else was behind me. I felt relieved, thinking maybe it was over. But that comfort didn't last. When I turned to close the fridge, I saw it again. That figure was there near the edge of the reflection. My heart jumped so hard I almost yelled. I slammed the fridge door shut, dropping a jar on the floor. It shattered, sending pieces of glass everywhere. I left the mess and backed away. My breathing was fast. I felt beads of sweat forming on my scalp. I grabbed a bunch of towels, cleaned up without looking directly at the shards. Then I tossed everything in the trash. My arms were shaking so badly I had to sit down again. I felt like I was under surveillance and I hated it. Later, I went to the elevator to bring out the trash. The metal doors reflected me. I tried not to look, but I have a habit of checking if I have my keys. So I looked down at my hand, then up at my reflection. The figure was standing next to me in the reflection. I lost my grip on the trash bag. I actually felt pressure on my right side. like something was near me. That made my whole body tense up. I slapped the elevator button to open the doors and dashed out into the hallway. There was no one behind me. I dragged the trash to the chute, dumped it, and took the stairs back to my place. I felt stiff and cold, like my muscles were locked. The more I ignored it, the closer he seemed to get. I noticed that each time I tried to pretend I didn't see him, he would appear even nearer. A few days later, it reached a point where, in any reflective surface, he was almost right at my shoulder. I felt my stomach churn every time I got a glimpse of him. It felt like he was waiting for the moment when I would finally acknowledge him face to face. I started to sweat just thinking about that possibility. I had constant headaches. I stopped sleeping well, worried that I'd wake up in the night and see him in my bedroom mirror right next to me. I stopped going to the gym. I called in sick to work for 2 days. I kept the TV on at all times, using it as background noise because I hated the silence. Whenever the TV was off, its screen was like a black mirror. I didn't want to see what might appear if I glanced at it. My phone was another problem. When it went to sleep, the screen turned black. Sometimes I'd see his faint shape there. So I started setting my phone to never go completely dark. I'd leave it face down when I wasn't using it. On the 3rd day of hiding in my apartment, I realized I had to do something. I decided to test a theory. If I tried to confront this figure, maybe I could get it to stop. It was a desperate idea, but I was out of options. My plan was simple. Find the largest mirror in my place, stand in front of it, and face him. I hoped that if I accepted his presence, maybe he'd disappear or reveal something that would end this. My heart raced just thinking about it, but I couldn't keep living in fear. I went to my bathroom. The mirror above the sink was wide enough to see most of the room behind me. I took a few deep breaths and looked at my reflection straight on. At first, I only saw myself. Then I caught movement behind me. He appeared. He stood directly behind my right shoulder, almost touching me. I felt a wave of cold sweat down my spine. My hands clenched on the sink edge. My legs wobbled. I fought the urge to turn around. I forced myself to keep looking at the mirror. He didn't move. He just stared at me. I couldn't see his eyes clearly, but I saw enough of his face to know he was looking right at me. My heart pounded, and I could hear my breath rasping in my throat. I said out loud, "I see you." My voice shook. I tried to stay calm, but my body was tense and I was shaking. He remained there. I couldn't hear him breathe. I couldn't smell anything unusual. But it felt like the temperature dropped. My scalp tingled. My vision blurred from the tears in my eyes. I wasn't crying from sadness. It was just raw fear. He lifted a hand, slowly, as if he wanted to put it on my shoulder. My chest tightened so much it hurt. I shut my eyes for a moment. I felt a slight touch, almost like static electricity, near my shoulder. I jerked away. When I opened my eyes, he was gone from the mirror. I looked around the bathroom. I was alone. I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon. My shirt was soaked in sweat. I turned on the faucet and splashed water on my face. Then I looked back at the mirror. Nothing unusual. I dried off and left the bathroom. I checked the TV screen in the living room. No one was there. I checked the window reflection. Nothing. I picked up my phone. The screen was black. I saw only my own face. He wasn't there anymore. That night, I went to sleep with the lights off for the first time in days. I woke up the next morning feeling better than I had in a while. I tested a few mirrors around the apartment. There was no sign of him. I didn't feel that pressure near me anymore. I decided to try the gym again. I got dressed and went back. After my workout, I walked into the locker room. I faced the mirror. I felt a jolt of anxiety in my gut, but I forced myself to stand there. I didn't see him. It was just me and the usual background. No one else was in the locker room at that moment, but it felt empty in a normal way. I don't know if he'll ever come back, but for now, he's gone. I keep my eyes open, though. Every time I glance at my reflection, I brace myself, half expecting him to be there. So far, he hasn't reappeared. My chest still gets tight when I think about how close he got in those final days. That feeling of him almost touching me hasn't faded. Sometimes I wake up at night and my mind goes back to that moment. My shoulder tingles and I'm sure I can feel him again. But when I look around, I see nothing. I still go to the gym. I still try to live my life. But I'll never look in a mirror without remembering what happened. And if he does show up again, I'm ready to stand there and face him, because hiding didn't help. Confronting him was the only thing that made him vanish. And if he returns, I'll do the same thing. I can't live in fear, not anymore. I can't forget the first time I saw that shape outside my door. It was late, and the only reason I noticed it was because I caught a glimpse of movement through the crack in my living room curtains. At first, I thought it was a trick of the street lamp or some neighbor stopping by. It wasn't. It stood in one spot turned toward my house, but never knocked or spoke. I stared at it for a long time, my heart pounding, wondering if it was a person or something else. I tried to push the thought away, but it never really left my mind. I live alone in a single-story house. It's not fancy, and it's pretty quiet here at night. I have a small front porch with a single light above the door. The interior of my house is basic. A living room with a couch and an old TV, a kitchen with a table that barely seats two, a narrow hallway, one bedroom, and a small bathroom. The walls are thin, and I can hear the wind outside when it picks up. That night I saw a silhouette through the curtains. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting on the side of the window, careful not to move the curtain too much. The figure didn't budge. It was like a statue, facing my door. I felt a chill on my arms. I felt my breathing become shallow. I watched for maybe a minute, then decided to turn off the living room light. Darkness felt safer, even though it only made me more aware of the figure's presence. I sat on my couch and tried to ignore the feeling that someone was right outside. My TV was off. My overhead light was off. I was left with only a table lamp in the corner. I couldn't relax. Every minute or so, I found myself looking toward the front door, half expecting to hear footsteps on the porch or a knock. But the knock never came. Nothing came. The figure just stayed out there. Eventually, I got up and turned off the table lamp. I peeked through the curtains again, barely lifting one corner. The street lamp threw a weak glow over the sidewalk and the edge of my yard. I could see the outline of a person, tall, or at least it looked tall. It was so still. No swaying, no shifting weight from one foot to the other. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. Something or someone stood there, silent, in the same spot as before. I checked the time on my phone. It was around midnight. I turned the screen away from the window so the glow wouldn't be noticed outside. I felt my stomach tighten. I tried not to think about it, but then I realized that if someone was outside, they knew the lights inside had turned off. They knew I was aware of them. My hands started sweating. My legs felt weak. I wondered if I should call the police. But what would I say? There's a figure outside my house that isn't moving or knocking. That sounded ridiculous. Plus, it hadn't done anything except stand there. An hour passed. I remember because I kept checking the time on my phone, and it was around 1 a.m. when I looked again. I glanced through the curtain. The shape was still there. My chest felt tight. I wanted to open the door and yell, but I also feared what would happen if I did. I tried turning on the porch light, hoping that would scare it off or reveal who it was. I got to the switch by the front door and flipped it. The bulb flickered on, and I could see a bit more of the figure. It was wearing something dark, maybe a coat, but I still couldn't see a face or any details. Then I noticed something that made me step back. It was closer. Before, it had been near the edge of the yard. Now it was standing just past the footpath to my porch. I hadn't seen it move. It was as if it had teleported a few feet closer. My mouth went dry. My scalp tingled. I turned off the porch light. I felt my heart pounding in my ears. I rushed back to the living room, almost stumbling over the coffee table. My breath came in quick bursts. I didn't know what to do. I switched on my TV, keeping the volume low, trying to distract myself. Nothing helped. I ended up hitting the mute button so I could listen for any noise outside. I heard nothing. The street was empty except for that figure. I used the remote to access the feed from my security cameras. I have 3 cameras, one pointed at the driveway, one at the front porch, and one at the backyard. The driveway camera showed me the side of the yard. No movement. The backyard camera was static. No problem there. But the front porch camera made me jump. The figure was definitely closer than before. It was maybe 8 feet from my front door, but I never saw it move on screen. One moment it was at the edge of the yard, and then a few frames later, it was by the porch stairs. I didn't see arms or legs clearly. It looked like a dark human shape that flickered forward when I wasn't looking. I felt sweat running down my face and neck. I wiped my forehead on my sleeve and tried to calm down. I pressed my back against the couch cushions, trying to breathe. I felt nauseous. I felt corners of panic creeping in. But I told myself I was safe inside, and the door was locked. I had the security chain in place. I tried to think of a plan. Another hour passed. It was around 2:00 a.m. The figure remained outside, never knocking or calling out. I left the TV on the security camera feed, watching it without blinking. At some point, I dozed off for a few minutes because I suddenly jerked awake and realized it was now almost 2:30. My eyes jumped to the screen and my heart dropped. The figure was standing right in front of the camera, but not facing it directly. It was angled in a way that I couldn't see details of a face. It was as if it knew exactly where to stand so the camera wouldn't capture its features. I saw the edge of a shoulder, or maybe the side of a head. It was tall, definitely taller than me. I didn't hear my phone ring or any alarm, but I was shaking. My chest was tight. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to open the door. I decided to check the back door, even though I almost never open it. I walked slowly down the hall, checking each room to make sure no one was inside. Everything was dark. The windows were all locked. My back door was locked too. I put on my jacket, grabbed my house key, and thought about slipping out the back. But I was afraid the figure would somehow be there as well. I changed my mind. I couldn't handle the idea of stepping outside into the darkness alone. At 3 a.m. I heard a faint rustling sound. I muted the TV to listen. I pressed my ear to the front door. Nothing else. Then I returned to the living room. I checked the camera feed and saw no movement. The figure was still there near the door, but slightly off to the side. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. I felt like it was listening to me, listening to every breath, every shuffle of my feet. I remembered some old letters I found in my attic a few months ago. I never paid much attention to them. They were dusty and smelled of mildew. They mentioned something about an entity that doesn't knock. I grabbed a box from the closet where I kept the letters. My hand shook as I flipped through them. It was a bunch of handwritten notes from a person who used to live here decades ago. They described nights of seeing a shape outside the door. They wrote about feeling a presence that never announced itself, never made a sound. The letters warned, never invite it inside. If you invite it, it never leaves. I dropped the pages onto the floor. My heart pounded. The words on those pages felt too real. I was reading about what I was experiencing now. I glanced at the front door again. The chain was still latched. The doorknob was locked. I could see the small seam of light from the porch. No shadows passed by. No knocks. No voice. I felt like I was in a nightmare where everything moved slowly except my thoughts, which ran wild. By 4 a.m. my eyes burned from strain and fear. I couldn't stop staring at the security feed. The figure was still right there, frozen in place or moving in small increments when I turned my head. Every time I blinked, I worried it would end up closer, maybe even inside. My mouth was dry, and my heart wouldn't slow down. I heard the wind outside. I heard the old house creak. I turned off the heater because the sound of the blower was messing with my ability to listen for movement outside. At some point, I got so tense that I decided to do something. I went to my kitchen drawer and grabbed a small flashlight and a dull steak knife. It's not much, but holding the knife made me feel a tiny bit safer. I tightened my grip on it and walked to the front door. I rested my hand against the wood, feeling my own pulse. I could sense something on the other side. It felt like a pressure or a vibration, almost like there was a low hum I couldn't quite hear. I stood there, trying to steady my breathing. Then I lifted the chain from the door just enough to see if it would react. Nothing happened. No movement. I put the chain back in place. I shook my head and stepped away from the door. I could smell my own sweat. My t-shirt clung to my back. My legs felt like they were going to buckle. I held onto the wall to steady myself. I stared at the door for a few more seconds, then went back to the living room. I lost track of time around 4:30. I paced back and forth, pausing to glance at the camera feed. The figure never left the frame. Sometimes I thought I saw it turning its head or shifting slightly, but it always happened when I looked away or blinked. I started to feel dizzy from lack of sleep and the constant adrenaline. My thoughts got jumbled. I thought about calling someone, but it was so late. I didn't want to sound crazy. I also wasn't sure if anyone would believe me. At 5 a.m., a faint glow of morning started to outline the sky. I looked at the small window high on the living room wall and saw the color changing from deep black to a lighter shade of gray. I tried to calm myself by thinking that daylight might drive this thing away. But then I checked the camera again and the figure was still there, motionless. Around 5:30, I heard birds chirping. Usually that's a sign of a new day, something that makes me feel normal. But that morning their sound felt out of place. I tried to swallow my fear and turn the porch light on again, hoping maybe now, with a bit of daylight and the porch light, I'd see the figure leave. Instead, I noticed it had moved about 1 foot closer to the door. My stomach twisted. I turned the light off again. I stepped back from the monitor, pressing my hand to my forehead. My pulse hammered. I considered barricading the door with furniture. But then I realized it might come through the windows. I felt an urge to scream, but I held it back. By 6 a.m., actual sunlight started to creep across my lawn. Through the curtain, I could see the brightness outside. Normally, that's when I'd start my day. I'd make coffee, shower, get ready for work. But now, I was glued to the security camera feed. The figure looked less solid in the light. It was still there, but it wasn't as sharp. I still couldn't see a face or features. It was just a dark shape. I thought maybe it was dissolving with the daylight, but it kept its position like a stain on my front porch. I waited another hour, checking every few minutes. The sun rose higher. The shape remained. I felt a wave of exhaustion slam into me. My eyelids drooped. I forced myself to stay awake by splashing water on my face in the bathroom sink. I stared at my reflection. My eyes were bloodshot, and I noticed lines of sweat dried on my temples. I patted my face with a towel and went back to the living room. By 7:30 a.m., there was enough daylight to see everything outside. My front yard, the street, the neighbor's driveway. But the figure was still there, dark and silent, about 2 feet from my front door. I took another look at the old letters scattered on the floor. They said never to invite it in. They said it never knocks, never tries to force its way. It waits for an invitation. I believed those words now. My entire body felt like a tightened spring. I wanted to run out the back door and never return, but it was my home. I couldn't just abandon it. I paced around the living room, then went to my bedroom to stare out the side window. Sometimes I could see the reflection of my front porch from a slight angle, but I couldn't see the figure from there. I thought about calling a friend or a neighbor, but I hesitated. What would happen if someone showed up and casually opened the door saying, "Hey, come in for a moment"? That would be an invitation. The letters said that's all it needs. So I stayed inside, alone, fighting off the crushing sense of dread. I wanted to sleep, but I was afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. I returned to the living room, flicked on the TV, and forced myself to watch the news. I tried to ignore the security feed, but every few minutes I switched back to see if the figure was gone. It wasn't. When the clock hit 8 a.m., I stood near the door and listened. There was no knocking, no scratching, no breathing. I lifted the curtain a bit, letting more light into the room. I saw the figure's outline pressed against the edge of the porch, almost blending into the shadows under the roof. My chest felt tight. My head hurt. I felt a wave of anger, like I wanted to shout and demand it leave, but I didn't. I remembered the letters. I didn't want to provoke it, and I definitely didn't want to give it any invitation to enter. As I write this, I'm still in my living room. The time is now 8:30 a.m. Daylight is strong, and I can see people walking their dogs a few houses down. Nobody seems to notice the figure. It's like it only exists for me. I've been awake all night, shaking and sweating. I keep checking the door, expecting a knock or a sudden push, but nothing happens. It just waits. My phone sits next to me, fully charged, but I can't bring myself to call anyone yet. I'm not sure what they could do. I'm watching the security feed right now. It's there, a dark shape against the pale light of morning. I feel it waiting for me to slip up, to open the door, to invite it inside. My plan is to hold out until it leaves. The letters suggest it might go away eventually if I never invite it in. I'm not certain. But I'm tired, and my mind is unraveling with worry. Still, I refuse to open that door. I don't know when it will leave. I don't know if it ever will. But I remember the warning. It never knocks. It just stands there until you give in or lose track of your words and let it cross the threshold. So I'll keep the chain in place. I'll wait. I'll keep an eye on the cameras. That's all I can do. And maybe if I'm lucky, it'll be gone by the time the sun sets again. If not, I'll lock every door and window. I'll sit here until my eyes burn and my lungs ache from holding my breath. Because letting it in is not an option, and I'm not willing to find out what happens if I do. I checked into the old hotel farm to escape my routine. I didn't want anything fancy. I just wanted to clear my head and get some rest. The receptionist gave me a key and told me my room was at the end of the main corridor on the second floor. The place looked worn, and the carpets in the lobby were faded. The walls had a dull yellow paint that seemed to peel in a few spots. I noticed the smell of old wood and some faint dampness, like the building had seen better days. I tried not to think too much about it. I just wanted a quiet retreat for a few days. The moment I settled into my room, I unpacked my clothes and tried to relax. My bed was firm. The sheets smelled like strong laundry detergent, so at least the cleaning staff did their job. There was a single window facing a field with tall grass and a small fence. A cool breeze came in when I opened the window, so that helped me ignore the musty smell in the room. After a quick look around, I decided to explore the hotel. That's when I noticed something unusual. There was a door at the far end of the second floor hallway. It looked older than the others, with chipped paint and a rusted knob. A sign hung there that said, "Do not disturb," in faded letters. The words seemed hand-painted. The wood around the frame had dark stains. They could have been water stains, but something about them looked off. I tried the knob out of curiosity, but it didn't budge. I went downstairs and asked the staff about the door. One was a middle-aged guy in a gray uniform. His name tag said Paul. He shrugged and said he didn't know anything about it. Another staff member, a woman in her late 20s, said she had never seen anyone go in or out. She looked at me with a puzzled expression. She said, "It's probably just a storage closet." But I could tell by her tone that she wasn't too sure. That door seemed to be one of those ignored corners of the place, something that nobody wanted to deal with. I tried to let it go, but a few days later I heard noises in the middle of the night. I'm a light sleeper, so any sound can wake me up. At first, it sounded like a distant clanking. I thought maybe it was just the ancient pipes in the walls. The noise got louder, and it seemed to come from down the hall. I left my bed, opened my door, and stood in the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit by a weak overhead lamp. I heard faint rattling that sounded like chains, and then I caught low moans. I couldn't tell if they were human voices or just the wind, but they gave me chills. My skin prickled, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I walked toward that old door. Each step made the boards under my feet creak. My heart thumped in my chest. and I tried to hold my breath to hear better. The closer I got, the more intense the sounds became. They were still muffled, like something was behind a thick wall. It definitely sounded like chains scraping and low groans. I felt lightheaded, but I kept moving. When I reached the door, I listened carefully. There was some kind of whispering, but I couldn't make out words. It was just a low murmur of voices. Then it all stopped, as if someone threw a switch. I hurried back to my room. I locked the door and tried to calm my breathing. I told myself it was just the plumbing or maybe my imagination. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. The next day I went to the lobby and tried to ask again, but I got the same blank stares and shrugs. The staff acted like I was making a big deal out of nothing. Paul just said he never heard anything, and he promised me that the old place sometimes made strange noises at night. Still, I couldn't shake the tension that was stuck in my gut. Later that evening, I decided to check out the door again. I walked by it casually, pretending I was just exploring. I pressed my ear against it. No sounds this time. The sign that said, "Do not disturb," looked even more worn up close. I noticed flakes of rust on the doorknob, and the area around the lock looked scratched, like someone had tried to force it at some point. That made me curious. I wondered if some guest had once tried to get in but gave up. That night, the noises returned. They were louder. I left my room again and walked down the hallway. The floor creaked under my weight. I carried a small flashlight this time because the corridor lights were weak. The beams of my flashlight fell on the door, and I saw rust streaks running down the knob onto the wood. The sign swayed a bit, as if someone had nudged it, but there was no draft. I don't know why it was moving. My heart pounded so hard that I felt an ache in my chest. My breathing turned quick and shallow. I reached for the doorknob, but it was locked as usual. Then I heard a clank on the other side. It sounded like a chain dropping. I jolted and stepped back. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I stood there for a good minute, maybe longer. I couldn't make sense of it. Then a series of muffled moans rose again, followed by whispers. My palms felt clammy on the flashlight. My mind raced with possibilities. I wondered if someone was trapped in there, but the staff insisted nobody use the room. My instincts told me something was off, and I couldn't let it go. I felt compelled to see what was behind that door. The next day, I asked a maintenance worker if I could borrow some tools. He was busy and didn't ask too many questions. He handed me an old screwdriver and a small crowbar. That night, I went back to the door, determined to force my way in. The corridor was quiet. The overhead light flickered a bit. I crouched by the knob and tried the screwdriver. The lock resisted. I felt sweat rolling down the side of my face, and my heart hammered in my ears. I jimmied the lock for a while, but it refused to open. Then I used the crowbar. I wedged it between the door and the frame, trying to leverage my weight against it. The door groaned and splintered. A few more tries, and the lock gave with a snapping sound. I pushed the door open, and a burst of foul odor hit me. It was so strong that I gagged and had to cover my nose with my sleeve. The smell reminded me of something rotten or stale. The air inside the room felt thick and cold, like a draft coming from a damp basement. My body tensed and I hesitated on the threshold. Finally, I pointed my flashlight inside. The room was dark and had only faint shapes. I stepped in, still holding the crowbar in one hand. The floor creaked under my feet and the beam of my flashlight cut through layers of dust in the air. The smell made my eyes water. I swept the light around and saw a bare floor with strange marks. They looked like shapes or letters drawn in something dark and crusted. The lines curved in odd ways, like symbols I didn't recognize. The corners of the room were empty. No furniture, no storage boxes, nothing. It was just an empty space with those weird markings on the floor. I felt an intense chill travel up my spine. My pulse pounded in my neck and I took a shaky breath. I kept expecting to see a person, but there was nobody there. My hand trembled a bit when I lowered the flashlight toward the symbols. They were dried, like they had been there for a long time. The color was brownish black. I didn't want to guess what it could be. The air felt heavier the more I stood there. Then I heard a faint scraping noise behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight at the door. Nothing moved, but my mind played tricks on me, and my muscles tensed. I moved the flashlight slowly across the walls. There were streaks and smudges like someone had tried to wash something away, but the stains remained in the plaster. I tried to steady my breathing. It was fast and my chest felt tight. I backed out of the room, still pointing the flashlight inside. I closed the door, but it wouldn't latch anymore because I had broken the lock. I left it as close to closed as I could and hurried back to my room. I spent the rest of that night tossing and turning. My heart wouldn't settle. My head was full of images of those symbols. I wondered if I had walked into something dangerous or something best left alone. I had trouble thinking straight. My hands shook a bit even when I tried to drink water. I told myself that the next day I would ignore it and maybe even check out early. But the next afternoon I wandered back to that hallway like I was in a trance. I found the door slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way, but I figured maybe it didn't close properly after the lock broke. The sign was still on the outside, hanging crooked. I peeked in. The odor inside was still strong, but somehow not as overpowering as before. The main difference, though, was the color of the markings. The symbols that had looked dark and dry the night before now had a wet sheen to them. I swear I could see a faint crimson shade, almost like fresh paint. It looked sticky. My stomach clenched, and I felt bile rise in my throat. I backed away and wiped sweat from my forehead. I tried to talk to the same staff members again. They denied any knowledge of what that room was for. They looked at me like I was making up stories. Paul wouldn't even meet my eyes. The younger woman just said, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't have any information," and walked off. I found the maintenance worker who gave me the tools. When I brought up the door, he just shook his head and said, "I don't know what you're talking about, buddy." Then he turned his back. It felt like everyone had decided not to get involved. They acted like they wanted me to drop it. I started feeling paranoid, like I was the only one who heard or saw anything. But I knew what I had seen, and the memory gnawed at me. The nights after that became worse. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the chains and the whispers. I sat up in bed, rubbing my temples, feeling sweat roll down my back. I tried to ignore it, but the noises wouldn't let me. I heard the floor creak outside my door, then soft scraping sounds, like something was being dragged. My heart pounded, and my hands turned clammy. I felt a knot in my stomach again. I tried to breathe slow, in and out, but each breath hitched with tension. I got up and opened my door. The corridor was empty, but the door at the end stood halfway open. I saw a faint flicker, like light coming from inside. I walked toward it, my legs shaking. When I reached the room, I stepped in. The flashlight beam bounced on the floor. The symbols had that fresh look again. They seemed to pulse, like they had some faint glow. The chain rattling was louder now, coming from the corners. There was no one there, but I felt a presence, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The stench filled my nose, and my eyes watered. I tried to step closer to the symbols, but my feet felt heavy. My throat tightened, and I fought the urge to run. I wanted to see if they were actually glowing or if my eyes were playing tricks. When I moved closer, the chain sounds seemed to circle me. I turned fast, shining the flashlight left and right, but I saw nothing. Then the whispering started again. It sounded like several voices speaking all at once in low tones. My chest tightened, and I thought I might pass out. I stumbled out of there, nearly tripping on the threshold. I rushed back to my room and locked the door. I packed my bag in a frenzy. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I had planned to stay a few more days, but I couldn't do it. That tension in my gut told me it was time to leave. I booked it downstairs before dawn. The front desk was empty. I left my key on the desk and walked out. I got in my car, turned the key, and drove away. I didn't look back at the building. My heart still pounded and my shirt was soaked with sweat. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind me, but all I saw was the empty road. My hands gripped the steering wheel and my breath felt shallow. I made it onto the main highway and tried to focus on each mile, leaving that place behind. I don't have an explanation for what happened. I know what I heard. I know what I smelled. I know those marks on the floor changed every time I looked at them. Nobody there would talk about it or even admit anything was strange. But I can't forget it. Even now when I close my eyes, I see those dark symbols and feel that cold air on my skin. Sometimes I wake up in a sweat, convinced I can hear the chain rattling again. I try to push it out of my mind, but it always comes creeping back in the quiet hours of the night. I haven't told many people about this. I don't want to sound like I lost my mind, but I'm sure I'll never set foot in that hotel farm again. I can't erase the smell, the sounds, or the sense that something in that room wanted attention, and I gave it more than it should have had. I knew something was off the moment I saw that strange shape on the edge of a photograph. I had developed the role in my darkroom, following every step with care. The chemicals were fresh. The equipment was clean. I saw nothing unusual when I took the shot, but the print showed a dark silhouette in the background standing near a table facing the camera. It didn't match anything in the room. That was the day I realized my routine had taken a turn I couldn't explain. I've worked with analog photography for years. I started in high school, learning how to load film onto reels in complete darkness, how to measure chemicals, how to watch the images appear on the paper. I never saw anything strange. My clients were mostly local businesses, couples wanting engagement photos or small fashion shoots. Nothing glamorous, just ordinary jobs that paid the bills. I had a small studio in a converted basement, filled with boxes of film, bottles of chemicals, and 3 enlargers. It was calm there, a bit cramped, but it had everything I needed. One evening, I pulled out a new roll that I had shot earlier in the week. It was just a simple set of pictures for a friend who needed some portraits. I switched on the safe light, loaded the film onto the developing reel, and followed my usual steps. I moved the spool from the developer to the stop bath, then to the fixer, drained the tank, rinsed the film. When I hung the negatives to dry, I caught something in the corner of my eye. I saw a darker patch on one of the frames. I thought it might be a defect in the emulsion or maybe a problem with the camera's shutter. I brushed it off. After the negatives dried, I examined them carefully. The rest of the pictures looked normal, except for one. In that shot, my friend was leaning against a brick wall. To the left, in the far background, stood a faint silhouette. It looked like a person, but there was no clear face or clothing details. I could only see a shape. I felt uneasy, but I assumed it was a trick of the light. I printed that frame. I watched the image appear in the developer tray. My friend's figure was clear and well lit. The silhouette appeared sharper on the print. I saw what looked like shoulders and a head, turned slightly to face the camera. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I checked the contact sheet for other anomalies. All the other frames were clean. I shrugged and stored the weird print in a folder, figuring I'd investigate later. A few days passed, and I processed another roll for a small product shoot. This time, the silhouette showed up again. It appeared in the background behind a display table with small jewelry pieces. The shape was more defined. I saw what seemed like arms crossed at the chest. I remembered who was in the studio that day. It was just me and the client. No one else was around. I started to feel tense. My stomach tightened. My hands felt cold. I checked the negatives again. The shape was there, faint but visible. I decided to test the camera. I used a different camera body and lens, thinking maybe there was a light leak or mechanical problem. I shot a new test roll taking photos of random objects in the studio. I developed them. The silhouette was in 3 of the frames, each time standing in a different part of the background, like it was trying to stay on the edge of the shot. I wiped sweat from my forehead and looked around my darkroom. It was just me, the hum of the ventilation fan, and the red glow of the safe light. I felt a small jolt in my chest every time I thought about that shape. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I kept telling myself it had to be a film defect. I tried switching to digital for a while. I used a DSLR for the next couple of jobs. I checked the shots on the viewfinder after each click. Everything seemed normal. But once I loaded the files onto my computer, I saw it again. A silhouette stood off to the side in 4 pictures from that day's session. My breath caught in my throat when I realized the figure was moving closer in each shot. In the first photo, it was near the corner. In the second, a bit closer. In the third, it seemed almost halfway to the center of the frame. By the fourth, it was near the subject, facing the camera with what looked like blank white eyes. My skin prickled, and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I leaned back in my chair and stared at my monitor. My heart was pounding. I checked the EXIF data, looking for some error or glitch. I zoomed in on the figure, looking for compression artifacts or signs of double exposure. It was none of those things. The silhouette had a shape like a tall person, arms by its sides, head cocked slightly. The eyes were white circles. They looked like holes. I turned off the computer and took a break. I needed air. I walked outside, left the door unlocked, and paced around the block. My pulse refused to settle down. I thought about quitting photography, at least for a little while, but this was my job. I depended on it. 2 days later, I received a message from a person who called herself a specialist in unusual phenomena. I had asked around in a few online forums about unexplained images and photographs. Most replies were jokes, but one person suggested contacting this woman. Her email said she'd seen similar cases and believed it might be something called an image parasite. She claimed it was a supernatural entity that attaches itself to people through photographs. I'd never heard of such a thing. I didn't believe in that type of stuff, but I felt desperate. I visited her in a small office above a diner on the other side of town. She was older, spoke quietly, and didn't smile much. She had a series of old photographs pinned to a corkboard. Each showed a figure in the background, similar to mine. She asked for my prints and digital files. I had them on a flash drive along with some physical prints. She studied them under a magnifying lamp, then nodded. She said that once an image parasite starts appearing, it feeds on the attention from each new photograph. It becomes more visible and more present with every shot taken by its target. According to her, these parasites follow people who engage heavily in photography or any visual medium. I felt my throat tighten as she explained that the parasite would continue to show up, inching closer, until it could manifest in a more physical way. She said there was no straightforward way to banish it unless I stopped taking photographs completely. When I asked how I was supposed to make a living, she shrugged. I grew frustrated. She told me I could try some old methods involving strong lights and certain cleansing rituals, but she couldn't guarantee anything. She also mentioned that if I continued to photograph, the entity would keep getting stronger. She seemed genuinely concerned, not just trying to sell me a story. That night, I tried to stay away from my cameras. I left my equipment in the studio, turned off the lights, locked the door, and went upstairs to my apartment. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall. My mind kept going back to those white eyes on my computer screen. I felt a knot in my stomach. My hands were shaky. I wondered if the silhouette would ever appear in real life, not just in photos. I reminded myself to stay logical. I didn't see anything out of place around me. Everything looked normal in the dim light of my living room. I heard the faint traffic outside, a dog barking somewhere. Nothing else. The next morning, I had a small shoot scheduled for a local fashion designer. I debated canceling, but I needed the money. I packed a digital camera, a few lenses, and headed out. The shoot took place in a simple studio space the designer had rented. I tried to act normal, focusing on the clothes and the lighting. I took about 50 shots, checking the camera's screen every few clicks. I didn't see anything unusual. The tension in my shoulders eased a bit. I told the client I'd send the files in a day or two. When I got back to my own studio, I transferred the images to my computer. I opened the first few in my editing software. They looked fine. By the time I reached the 10th photo, I noticed a faint shape near the background, behind a rack of clothes. In the 15th photo, the shape stood behind the model, its head turned toward me. I felt a heavy pressure in my chest. I clicked the next images in rapid succession. The figure moved forward in each shot like a series of freeze frames. By the 40th photo, it was right behind the model, leaning toward the camera. I could make out white circles where the eyes should be. My hands shook. My breathing grew shallow. I closed the program and rubbed my temples. I remembered the specialist's words. It would keep getting closer. I set my camera aside and decided to try the cleansing technique she mentioned. She had given me a sheet of instructions. It involved shining a bright flashlight onto photos where the figure appeared. She said I should speak certain words out loud. I wasn't sure if this would work, but I had no other plan. I grabbed the prints that clearly showed the silhouette and laid them on a table. I turned off the main light and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at each image. I read the words, which were in some obscure language, or maybe it was just a phonetic script. I felt silly, but I forced myself to keep going. My voice shook. My back felt tight. I repeated the procedure for all the prints and then for my computer screen, shining the flashlight at the digital images. I felt a bit ridiculous doing that, but I was desperate to try everything. After I finished, I sensed no obvious change. The room felt the same. My eyes burned from staring at the bright light. My throat was dry from reading words I didn't understand. I sat on a stool and waited, half expecting something dramatic. Nothing happened. I spent the next few days avoiding any new photos. I rescheduled 2 small gigs, pretending I was sick. I stayed in my apartment, flipping through TV channels, scrolling through social media on my phone. I tried to relax, but I kept thinking about that thing. I wanted to see if the cleansing had helped, but I was afraid to take more photos. My income was basically on hold. By the 4th day, I started feeling the financial pressure. I couldn't just stop working. My head ached. I decided to do a test with a cheap disposable camera. If the thing showed up, at least the digital workflow wouldn't be involved. I took the camera outside and snapped a few shots of a parking lot, some storefronts, and a bus stop. I dropped the camera off at a 1-hour photo lab, paid, and waited. While I waited, I looked around the store. People were browsing prints. A machine whirred behind the counter. I tried to remain calm. My skin felt clammy. My jaw clenched when I saw the technician come over with my envelope. I sat in my car, opened the prints, and flipped through them. The first few were normal shots of the parking lot, a row of cars, and some random people walking by. My heart pounded as I neared the last photos. Then I saw it. In the second-to-last print, near a lamppost, stood the silhouette. The figure looked less transparent. I could see a dark outline of a face, but the eyes were still white. It was turned toward me. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I let out a low groan. The cleansing hadn't worked. My muscles felt weak. I drove straight to the specialist's office. She listened to my report. She told me again that stopping photography was the best solution. I told her that wasn't an option. I had bills to pay. I couldn't just give up my career. She said the parasite fed on my act of taking photos, and every new shot gave it more power. I asked if there was some way to trap it, maybe in a single image, and then destroy that image. She said it might work, but she had only heard rumors. We talked about using an extremely bright light source that could overload the medium, possibly severing the parasite's link. I went back to my studio and grabbed a high-powered strobe light. My idea was simple. I'd take one last shot with the strobe at maximum power. The flash would be intense. Maybe it would burn the image and disrupt the parasite. I set up a tripod, put a mirror on the other side of the room, and aimed the camera at the mirror so it would capture me. I wanted the silhouette to appear next to me, if it was going to appear at all. I attached a big strobe with a huge power pack. The instructions warned that it was extremely bright and could damage eyesight if used too close. I stepped back, set the focus, and took a deep breath. I pressed the shutter button. The strobe fired with a deafening pop. A harsh light filled the room. My eyes hurt. My head rang. I blinked hard. The camera beeped, indicating it had taken the shot. I checked the LCD screen. The image was mostly blown out, a wash of white. I did see a faint shadow near my left shoulder, but it was impossible to tell what it was. I felt a rush of relief followed by a wave of exhaustion. My knees felt weak. My heart pounded as if I'd just run a race. I haven't seen the parasite in any photos since then. I've gone back to taking pictures for work. using both film and digital. I check every image carefully. Sometimes I think I see a blur in the background, but it never forms into a silhouette. I avoid sharing my story with clients or colleagues because it sounds bizarre. But I keep a file of all those old prints and digital copies just to remind myself of what happened. I keep the strobe light in my closet, ready to fire again if needed. For now, everything seems normal. I don't know if the parasite is gone for good. All I can do is stay alert and keep shooting. If it ever comes back, I know what I'll do. I'm not ready to give up photography. I'll face it again if I have to. Feeling confident about my business trip. The lobby looked pristine, with polished floors and stylish chairs arranged in a neat row. The staff at the front desk wore matching suits and spoke in calm, measured voices. They took my luggage, escorted me to the elevator, and told me my room was on the 11th floor. I remember checking my watch and thinking I had enough time to settle in before the networking event that evening. I felt focused and ready to make the most of this trip. That confidence started to fade on the very first night. I'm writing this because I need to get it all out. I don't plan to show it to anyone, but it helps me process what's happening. I want to stay clear-headed. I have one more night in this place, and the feeling in my gut tells me to keep track of every moment. On my first night, I went to bed around 11:00 p.m. after reviewing some sales figures. My room had a king-size bed, large windows that overlooked the city, and thick curtains that blocked out the streetlights. The air conditioning hummed softly. Everything seemed normal. At around 3:17 a.m., I woke up. I had this intense pressure on my chest like a heavy object pinned me down. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw shifting shadows on the ceiling. They looked too large to be a trick of the light from outside. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. My first thought was that I might be having a nightmare, but I felt awake. I could move my fingers. I tried to reach for the bedside lamp, but my arm felt weighted. The pressure eased after a few seconds, and I turned on the light. The ceiling looked plain white, no shadows. I sat there, breathing hard, drenched in sweat. The next morning, I went down to the reception and asked if anyone else had reported strange occurrences. The manager on duty was polite, but clueless. She said no one ever complained about weird noises or shapes in the room. I remember her expression. She didn't look worried. She looked slightly amused. I guess I seemed tired and stressed, and maybe she assumed I'd had a rough travel day. I left it at that and went about my business meetings. The second night, it happened again. I turned off the lamp at 11:30 p.m. I'd had a glass of water before bed and felt calm. I checked my phone for messages, placed it on the nightstand, and tried to sleep. At 3:17 a.m. sharp, I snapped awake. Same feeling on my chest, same sense of dread, the same movement above me. I saw those shadows swirling around, but not in a random pattern. They formed something like a circle that expanded and shrank. My throat felt tight. My heart raced. I struggled to move my body. After maybe 10 seconds, I managed to switch on the lamp. The shadows vanished. The ceiling looked normal. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake, half sitting in bed, staring at the ceiling with the lights on. My mind felt scattered. I kept replaying the images, the swirling shapes, the heaviness on my chest. I wondered if I was hallucinating. I decided I'd mention it to the hotel manager in a more direct way in the morning, but I worried about sounding delusional. The next day I spoke to the same manager, only this time I asked if the room had any history. She told me the hotel was relatively new. She repeated that no one had complained about nightmares or illusions. I tried to push the topic, but she politely changed the subject to ask if I needed assistance with any housekeeping requests. I realized I wasn't going to get anywhere with her, so I left. That afternoon, I had a break between meetings. I went back to the room to rest. I sat on the edge of the bed feeling restless. My eyes landed on the thick carpet. The design was plain gray with no patterns. Suddenly, a random thought struck me. What if there was something under the carpet? I dismissed it at first, but the idea kept nagging me. I had seen a slight bump near the left corner, close to the wall. I walked over, crouched down, and pressed on that spot. The carpet was loose. Curious, I pulled it back. My pulse sped up when I saw pencil marks on the concrete floor underneath. They were thin lines and shapes that looked like geometric symbols. There were circles connected by triangles, small arcs, and strange markings that looked foreign to me. I peeled more of the carpet away until I uncovered a big section of the floor. The symbols formed a wide pattern that stretched under the bed. My skin prickled. The lines looked too organized to be random scribbles. My first thought was that some previous occupant had drawn them for a prank, but something about the careful detail made me uneasy. I quickly set the carpet back in place and stood there, my heart thumping. I realized I needed more information, so I grabbed my phone and searched online for any references to those shapes. After a few vague results, I stumbled onto some obscure forums about occult practices. People posted pictures of symbols used for summoning different entities. Some images resembled what I'd seen. I didn't recognize the language, but it made me feel tense and shaky. I wasn't ready to believe in that stuff, but my instincts told me there was a connection. I decided not to tell the hotel staff. I didn't want them thinking I'd lost my mind. Instead, I planned to gather more evidence. I took photos of the markings with my phone, making sure to get a clear shot of each section. Then I tucked the carpet back neatly so no one would notice. That night I considered changing rooms, but something in me wanted to figure out what was happening. I wanted to face it, or at least understand it. The third night, I prepared. I left a lamp on. I had my phone's flashlight ready at my side. I tried to relax, but my nerves were on edge. I laid down around midnight, stared at the ceiling, and fought against drowsiness. Eventually, I dozed off. And again, around 3:17 a.m., I jolted awake. My chest tightened. I felt that crushing weight again. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My hand shook. I shined it on the ceiling and saw a flicker of movement. It was like a ripple crossing the white surface. The wave of darkness disappeared quickly. I gasped for air, my lungs burning. I rolled onto my side and forced myself to sit up. The heaviness lifted. I felt drained, my heart hammering. I didn't see any figure, just a final tremor of shadow near the corner of the room. I turned on every light I could. I stayed up until morning. During the day, I went online again. I found more references to rituals performed in closed spaces, usually sealed under floors or hidden in walls. The texts said these rituals sometimes trapped entities that needed to be banished through a proper procedure. I don't usually believe in this kind of thing, but the repeated pattern of waking up at the same time, the physical pressure, and the shadows matched too well. One forum user mentioned that if an entity isn't dispelled, it can linger. The idea made my stomach churn. I felt sweat on my forehead just reading about it. I took some notes on what these forums suggested, but I realized I had no clue how to do any kind of real banishing. One post said that if you can't perform the ceremony correctly, you shouldn't even try. Another said ignoring it might let it grow stronger. I wasn't sure what to do. I called an old friend who's into various esoteric practices, but I got his voicemail. I didn't feel comfortable explaining this in a message, so I just said I needed to talk as soon as possible. He never called back. I spent the rest of the afternoon staring at the clock, trying not to think about the upcoming night. By now I was running on adrenaline and coffee. When evening came, I went down to the lobby bar and had a couple of stiff drinks to calm my nerves. I watched people chat around me. They seemed at ease, laughing, checking their phones. I listened to their voices, trying to distract myself from my room upstairs. I stayed there until close to midnight, then forced myself to head back up. In the elevator, my fingers tapped the rail. My heart rate picked up the moment the doors opened onto the 11th floor. The hallway was quiet. The overhead lights flickered once, making me jump, but they settled. I walked to my door, slid in the key card, and stepped inside. I stood by the entrance for a few minutes, just listening. The air conditioning made its usual low noise. I could hear a faint hum of city traffic through the windows. Nothing else. I told myself to gather my courage. I knelt by the corner of the room, lifted the carpet, and traced the lines with my fingertips. The pencil marks felt smooth on the concrete. It gave me chills. Part of me wanted to grab something to scrub it all away, but another part worried that might make things worse. According to some of those forums, messing up a seal or a circle could release whatever was contained. I didn't want to risk that. I carefully replaced the carpet and stood up. I turned on every single light, including the bathroom one. I put the desk lamp on the floor, aimed at the bed. I sat in the armchair for a while, scrolling through more sites on my phone. Some recommended reciting certain words, but I didn't trust random incantations from strangers online. One site suggested placing salt around the bed. That sounded like a cheap horror movie trick, but I was desperate. I went to the minibar area, found some packets of salt next to the coffee machine. It wasn't much, but I sprinkled it in a rough circle around the bed. I felt silly doing it, but my gut told me to try. I finally lay down. Time crawled. The digital clock on the bedside table read 2:55 a.m. I stared at it, waiting. My mind felt jumpy, my muscles tensed. I squeezed the blanket in my fists. I noticed my breath getting shallow. I kept the lamp on. 3:10 a.m. approached. My heart slammed in my chest. I tried to keep my eyes open, but I drifted. At 3:17 a.m., I woke with a jerk. The air felt thick. My chest tightened so badly it hurt. I forced my eyes open and saw the shadows swirl on the ceiling again. I tried to lift my arms. My limbs felt like lead. I managed to nudge my phone, but it slid off the nightstand and hit the floor. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, like a cramp squeezing my lungs. I made a choked sound. The swirl of shadows grew. I could see them forming an expanding ring in the center of the ceiling. I thought about the salt. I forced myself to look down at the floor. The circle was still there, but the pressure on my chest didn't ease. I pushed against the mattress with my palms, trying to sit up. My arms trembled. After a moment, I succeeded. My chest felt a little lighter. I grabbed the lamp from the floor, pointed it at the ceiling, and the swirling shapes flickered. For a second, I saw something resembling an outline in the center. My scalp tingled. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the lamp. Then it vanished. My breathing was ragged. Sweat covered my entire body. I stayed there, holding the lamp in my hand for the rest of the night. Now it's the next morning. I'm sitting on the bed with my laptop on my knees, typing this out. My flight leaves tomorrow afternoon, and I'm supposed to stay one more night. I'm thinking about booking an earlier flight, but my pride is in the way. I keep telling myself there must be a rational explanation, but every night has been the same. Same time, same crippling weight, same shifting shadows. I can't dismiss the symbols under the carpet. They're real. I've seen them with my own eyes. I've taken photos. I have them saved on my phone. I haven't spoken to the manager again. I might just leave without a word and never return to this hotel. But part of me wonders if I should warn someone about the drawings on the floor. Maybe the hotel can bring in somebody to remove them. Or maybe they'll just think I'm making it up. My mind keeps racing with these questions. I don't have answers, and I doubt I'll find them in the next few hours. Right now, I'm exhausted. My hands are still trembling a bit. My mouth feels dry. I'm going to buy a large bottle of water from the lobby store, then maybe see if I can get some fresh air. I'll avoid the manager. I don't want any more polite smiles or dismissive comments. Tonight, I'm planning to leave every single light on, keep my phone in my hand, and try to stay awake. If I can make it to sunrise, I'll get out of here. I'll pack my things, take the first flight I can find, and never look back at this place. I just want to shake off the memory of those nights and that crushing sensation on my chest. I don't know if there's something supernatural here or if it's a psychological reaction to stress. All I know is that every time I've closed my eyes past midnight, I've had the same experience at exactly 3:17 a.m. My chest still hurts a bit. My throat is tight. Every time I blink, I see those shadows swirling above me. I'll gather my courage and push through one more night. After that, I'm gone. I'm done. I remember that night clearly. It was foggy, and I had this uneasy feeling in my stomach as I drove along a dirt road that didn't get much traffic. I'd been taking a back route to avoid a main highway closure. There was almost no visibility beyond a few feet, and my headlights only lit up a thick wall of mist in front of me. I rolled down the window a bit to keep myself alert, but the damp air clung to my face. My knuckles felt stiff on the steering wheel, and my shoulders were tense from leaning forward, trying to see past the fog. I was on a straight stretch of dirt, lined by tall trees that looked like dark silhouettes against the faint moonlight. The road was bumpy, and every small rock or hole made my car jostle. I kept the radio off because I wanted to hear any sign of oncoming vehicles, although deep down I didn't expect to see anyone. Then I caught sight of a shape through the haze. I tapped the brakes and peered ahead. It looked like a person walking by the roadside. I slowed down until I was barely moving. My heart started to pound because I didn't see anyone out there before, and a pedestrian on this road in the middle of the night seemed odd. Through the blur of fog, I could see an arm come up like a wave for help. I hesitated. I thought about just driving past, but part of me felt guilty. The figure was alone, in the dark, on a deserted road. I decided to pull over. The moment I brought the car to a stop, I realized something was off. The figure I saw was gone. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and stuck my head a bit further out of the open window. Nothing. No one. The wind rustled through the trees, and I thought I heard faint footsteps somewhere close, but I couldn't pinpoint them. I turned in my seat to look behind the car, wondering if the person had walked around the back, but the rear windshield showed only swirling fog. That's when I heard it, the sound of heavy breathing, like someone trying to catch their breath. It came from inside the car. I felt a jolt of adrenaline in my chest. My pulse hammered in my ears. I quickly glanced at the passenger seat, but it was empty. The sound was behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a figure sitting in the back seat, staring straight at me. The face was pale, the eyes locked on mine, and the shape was blurry, as if not fully there. My stomach dropped. My jaw clenched. I spun around to look directly, but there was no one there. I let out a shaky exhale and turned forward again. My hands were damp with sweat, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I told myself I must be tired or my eyes were playing tricks on me. I tried to steady my breath. Then I heard that breathing again, slow and rough, like someone was exhausted. I glanced at the mirror. Nothing. I kept the engine running, and the car idled in a low rumble. I could feel the seat vibrate under me. I decided to move on. I didn't want to stay in that spot. I eased my foot onto the gas. The wheels spun a little in the loose dirt, and I kept an eye on the mirror. My reflection looked tense, and I felt a chill even though the night was humid. The temperature in the car seemed to drop. My arms broke out in goosebumps. The air smelled stale. I switched on the heater, but the vents blasted only lukewarm air. That heavy breathing grew quieter, like it was receding into some corner of the back seat. As I drove, I fiddled with the radio, hoping some music or even static would calm my nerves. The display flickered and crackled, then cut out completely. The digital clock on the dashboard started to flash random numbers before going blank. A wave of dread sank into my gut. My eyes darted back to the rearview mirror. I saw a quick flicker of movement behind me, a kind of silhouette, but it vanished. I felt my scalp prickle with fear. My entire body was rigid. I tried to shake it off by focusing on the road. My headlights lit up the dirt track, and the fog swallowed everything else. The trees on both sides seemed to press in. My tires crunched the gravel, and I could hear the occasional knock of a small rock bouncing off the undercarriage. But my mind kept drifting back to that presence in the car. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Suddenly, the steering wheel jerked in my hands like someone grabbed it. I yelped and yanked it back. The car swerved for a second, and I managed to straighten out. My heart pounded even harder. My breathing turned shallow, and I felt a tremor in my legs. I let out a shaky laugh, trying to calm myself. Maybe I'd just hit a rut or a stone in the road. Still, I couldn't ignore the sensation of a force on that wheel. I wiped sweat off my forehead with my sleeve and adjusted my grip. My mouth was dry, so I reached for the bottle of water in the cup holder. I took a swig, noticing how quiet the cabin was now. Even the breathing seemed gone. That silence felt unsettling. It was so complete that my own gulping sounded loud. I replaced the bottle and checked the mirror again. Empty, but then the hair on my arms stood up, and the back of my neck went cold. I felt as if someone was right behind me, leaning forward, watching me. I could almost feel a faint pressure near my shoulder, like a cold breath. I pressed the gas pedal harder, wanting to get away from whatever was happening. The car bumped along, and I gripped the wheel until my forearms ached. I kept my eyes forward, but I couldn't stop glancing at the mirror. Each time I expected to see that figure's face. My shoulders felt tight, and my hands were cramping. The heater started sputtering. The air that came out turned icy cold, even though I had it set to high. My teeth chattered for a second. The cabin smelled different now, kind of musty, like damp earth. I reached down to turn off the heater completely, hoping that would help. As I did, I noticed the radio display flicker back on, but it showed a random station number I didn't recognize. A burst of static hissed through the speakers, then a low moan. It didn't sound like a song. It sounded like a person in pain. I swore under my breath and turned the volume down until it was silent again. Everything felt surreal, but also immediate. My hands kept trembling. My heart wasn't slowing down. I was desperate to see another car or a house or any sign of normal life. The fog made it impossible to see far. The lights on the dashboard were still glitching, occasionally flashing or dimming. My phone was on the passenger seat, but there was no signal out here. I slid it into my pocket, feeling no comfort from having it. I started thinking about turning back. Maybe I needed to go back to that spot where I'd seen the hitchhiker. It didn't make any sense, but I felt this weird pull. Maybe that was the only way to get rid of this presence. The idea of turning around in the middle of the road made me nervous, though. I envisioned myself stepping out of the car, turning around, and seeing a figure standing behind me. My stomach twisted. I stayed in my seat, fighting the urge to slam on the gas and drive until the road ended. After a few minutes, I forced myself to slow down. I looked at my fuel gauge, half a tank. Enough to try something. I took a deep breath, cleared my throat, and whispered to myself, "I'm going back." I didn't know why I said it out loud, but it felt like I was announcing my plan, maybe to the presence. My words sounded shaky in the silence. I found a small clearing off to the side where the road widened a bit. I slowed to a crawl and turned the wheel, feeling the tires slip in wet dirt. The car faced the opposite direction now, aiming back the way I came. My heart pounded even harder and my muscles burned with tension. Part of me wanted to keep going forward and never look back, but my gut insisted on returning to that spot. I started retracing my path. The fog still rolled around me. The road felt even darker now. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds and there wasn't a single star visible. The only light came from my headlights, which illuminated the gravel in front of me. The uneven road rattled the car. I clutched the steering wheel, leaning in again, peering through the windshield. Then a loud thump echoed from behind me, like something hitting the back seat or the trunk. I jolted upright and almost let go of the wheel. My breath caught in my throat and I felt a jolt of terror in my gut. I stared at the rearview mirror, half expecting the glass to break or the entire thing to rip off. I saw nothing but the faint reflection of the back seat. My chest felt tight. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. I don't know why I yelled. Maybe I thought scaring it off or confronting it would help. Everything stayed quiet after that. The only sound was the crunch of the tires. I pressed my lips together, swallowed hard, and kept going. My mouth felt dry again, but I didn't dare reach for the water. After a few miles, I saw the same tree line that I remembered near where the hitchhiker first appeared. My skin tingled with anticipation. I kept the car at a low speed. My headlights swept across the dusty ground. I didn't see any sign of a person. The air felt heavy. My breathing was shallow, and my palms left damp streaks on the wheel. I came to a stop at roughly the same spot. I killed the engine, leaving only the faint glow of the dashboard lights. My hands trembled as I unfastened my seatbelt. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the silence press in on me. I didn't hear that breathing anymore. The car felt empty. Still, my muscles were tight and my shoulders ached from how rigid my posture was. I reached for the door handle. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I opened the door and stepped out. My feet sank into the soft dirt, and I felt the chilly mist on my face again. I stood there scanning the area. Everything looked gray and fuzzy with the fog swirling around. I didn't see footprints or any sign of a hitchhiker. I didn't hear any movement. The trees stood still and the damp air muffled everything. My breath felt caught in my throat. I moved around to the back of the car, turned on my phone's flashlight and pointed it around. The beam cut through the fog in a small circle. No figure, no footprints. The hair on my arm still stood on end. My chest was tight, but I tried to calm my breathing. The quiet was unsettling, but at least I didn't feel that cold presence hovering around me. I walked up and down the road for a few paces, checking either side, feeling uneasy with every step. My pulse thudded in my ears. Then I returned to the driver's seat. I got in and closed the door. The inside of the car felt less cold. It was still damp and uncomfortable, but it didn't have that intense chill. I switched the ignition on. The engine came to life with a normal hum. The lights on the dashboard were steady, and the radio screen showed the time accurately. The heater worked when I turned the dial, pushing out warm air. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. I let out a long, shaky exhale. My shoulders slumped with relief, but I was still on edge. I sat for a couple of minutes, letting the engine idle. No static came from the radio. The temperature didn't drop. I felt nervous, but not terrified like before. I put the car into gear and started driving forward again, following the same road, but in the original direction I had intended to go. I kept checking the mirrors, waiting for that face to appear again. It never did. As I pressed on, the fog began to lift. The dense grayness thinned out, and I could see more of the trees around me. After a while, I spotted the main highway in the distance, its lights glowing faintly. My hands still shook and my stomach churned, but I was moving away from that eerie stretch of road. I reached the highway and merged onto it. Other cars were there, their headlights and taillights a welcome sight. The tension in my body started to ease. I turned on the radio. Music played without interruption. I kept driving for another hour before finally pulling over at a gas station. My legs felt weak, and my throat was parched. I filled up the tank, went inside for another bottle of water, and just stood there under the harsh fluorescent lights for a minute. The cashier asked if I was okay. I just nodded, though my face probably looked drained. I sipped some water, noticing how plain everything felt in comparison to that strange experience. Even now, I can recall every detail of that night. I remember the weight of that presence in my car, the cold air, the heavy breathing, the flickering electronics. I don't know what it was, and I don't know if going back to the spot somehow released it. All I know is that once I returned to where I saw that hitchhiker, things started to feel normal again. I never saw anyone. I never saw that figure after that either. I haven't taken that dirt road since. I stick to highways and well-lit routes, even if it means a longer drive. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror a little too often, expecting to see that pale face staring at me. I still feel the pinch of dread in my chest when I pass through foggy areas, but I try not to think about it too much. It doesn't help to dwell on it. That's all that happened. I won't forget it anytime soon. It still makes my heart race when I talk about it. I can't explain it, and I don't like to guess. But I'm certain of one thing. Something joined me in my car that night, and it left only after I went back to that lonely patch of road. I haven't told many people because I'm not interested in arguments about what I might have seen. I know what I experienced. I felt it on my skin and in my bones, and that's enough for me. I walked into that boarding house with my head low, my mind focused on my empty wallet. I just needed somewhere cheap, somewhere I could rest without spending more than I had. I never cared about the neighborhood. I wasn't bothered by the cracked paint or the odd smell in the lobby. All I wanted was a place to put my bag and lie down without thinking about how I'd cover next month's bills. When I first talked to the owner, she seemed in a hurry. She told me her name, Lucinda or something like that. She kept looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to appear from nowhere. She offered me a room on the top floor. I thought she meant the usual top floor, but she actually had a small attic space. It had low ceilings and slanted walls. She said it was cheaper than the regular rooms. I said fine. I wasn't in the mood to argue. I followed her up the old staircase, listened to the squeaks under my feet. It felt like each step might break, but I kept going because I had nowhere else to stay. The attic door was a thin piece of wood at the end of a narrow hallway. When Lucinda pushed it open, a waft of stale air hit my face. It smelled like dust and something else I couldn't place. The single window was caked with grime. The only furniture was a small bed, a rickety table, and an old wooden chair. I saw exposed beams in the ceiling, and the rafters overhead looked cracked in places. It didn't seem safe, but I reminded myself, it was cheap, it had a lock on the door, and it was out of the rain. I told her it was fine and handed her the small deposit. She left me a single key and walked off without much more to say. I dropped my duffel bag on the floor. I tried not to think about the smell or the flickering bulb that provided a weak yellow light. My mind was on saving money, not comfort. I sat on the bed. The mattress springs creaked under me. The bed sagged in the middle. My stomach growled, so I opened the bag of groceries I had and ate some crackers. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was a soft murmur, like people talking in another room. At first I thought maybe there was a TV on somewhere. The walls were thin. But then I noticed something strange. Whenever I moved, the sound seemed to fade. If I cleared my throat, or shifted, or just let out a sigh, the murmurs stopped. It was only when I stayed perfectly still, not even breathing loudly, that I heard multiple voices whispering. I couldn't pick out any distinct words right away. It was just low, hushed chatter, like a crowd murmuring behind a wall. I got up, walked around, pressed my ear against the walls. Everything was quiet. I sat back down on the bed and tried to be still. Sure enough, after a minute or two, the whispering started again. It was impossible to understand, so I shrugged it off as thin walls or maybe just old plumbing. Still, it bothered me. It felt odd, like the voices were right in my ear. Over the next few days, I went about my routine. I left early for my job search and came back late with cheap takeout. The halls always felt cold. The staircase always creaked. I saw a few other tenants in the hallway, but no one seemed eager to talk. They looked down, nodded, or mumbled a greeting. At night, I'd lie on my bed, exhausted, half listening to those whispers. I tried to tune them out. Sometimes I turned on my phone to watch a video, just so I wouldn't hear them. But eventually, I ran out of data, and the building's Wi-Fi never worked right. So I was left in the silence of that attic, hearing the voices come and go. One evening, I decided to see if I could catch any real words. I turned off the single overhead bulb, making the attic dark. I settled on the bed and tried to stay as quiet as possible. My heart was thumping because the idea of listening to these mystery voices made me uneasy. But I did it anyway. I stayed still until I felt an itch on my arm. I ignored it. I kept my breathing shallow. After a while, I heard them again. At first, it was just that same murmur, a jumble of voices. But as I remained quiet, I began to hear fragments of sentences. Somebody was saying something about, "The time has passed." Another voice was talking about the shift. Then there was a voice that sounded urgent, talking about him, or he, or something like that. I thought it might be about someone else in the building. Then I heard my own name, clear as day. It felt like a jolt in my chest. I froze. My eyes were wide open in the dark, staring at nothing. Nobody in this building knew me well enough to mention my name. I barely gave it to the owner, and she had trouble even pronouncing it. Yet here it was, spoken in that hushed, tense way. I felt goosebumps run down my arms. I wanted to say something, but I was afraid that if I made a noise, The voices would vanish. I forced myself to keep still, heart pounding. I heard more phrases, but they were broken up. Something like, "He needs to see," and, or "It will keep going." Then everything went silent. I waited a few minutes. No more whispering. I finally exhaled and realized I was shaking. I turned the light on and paced around the attic trying to make sense of it. The next day I kept telling myself it was just stress or maybe neighbors talking about someone else with my name, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was directed at me. Late that evening, I decided to explore the attic a little more. I slid aside the small wooden chair and climbed onto it so I could inspect the rafters overhead. The wood was dusty, spiderwebs were clinging to the corners, and some boards had dark stains. I wasn't sure if it was water damage or something else. Then I saw something etched into the beam near the window. It looked like a circle with odd lines crossing it, and there was some writing I couldn't read. It might have been letters or symbols from a language I didn't recognize. I pulled out my phone's flashlight and shined it across more of the beams. That's when I noticed dozens of smaller symbols, all carved or drawn in faded chalk. Some looked like spirals, others looked like eyes. A few were repeated in different spots. My stomach felt tight. I was scared, but I also wanted to keep looking. I ran my finger along one of the carvings. The wood felt rough and a little piece chipped off. My fingers started to tingle like a small electric buzz. It startled me. I jerked my hand away, half expecting something to jump out. Nothing happened, but I had a dull ache in my fingertips. That night I laid awake, listening to the whispers. They got louder whenever I stayed still. I heard my name again, and they said something about opening the door or breaking the chain, but I couldn't be sure. It was as if multiple people were in the room whispering around me. Every time I tried to speak, the voices would stop. Then my heart would race, and I'd break into a sweat. I would lie there in the dim light, just trying to keep my breathing steady. The following morning, I asked Lucinda about the attic's history. I didn't mention the voices. I just asked if there had been any previous tenant who might have left behind weird carvings. She seemed irritated that I was bothering her. She said something about the attic being used for storage. She claimed she didn't know anything about carvings. I could tell she was lying because her voice trembled and she wouldn't look me in the eye. I didn't push the subject. I just backed off and went about my day. Over the next week, the voices became more distinct. They kept mentioning certain names I recognized from my past. Old friends, old enemies, even the name of a place I used to work. My chest felt tight every time I heard that. I couldn't understand why these voices had that information. I had never told anyone in this boarding house about my personal life. One night I decided I needed to investigate more of the attic. I stood on the chair again, but this time I tried to move aside a loose board in the far corner. I used a small screwdriver from my bag. The board popped up with a creak, revealing a cramped space between the rafters. I shined my flashlight inside and saw more symbols scrawled on the underside of the wood. They seemed newer, like someone had drawn them recently. My heart was pounding. I felt sweat roll down the back of my neck. I also found a small bundle of cloth stuffed in there. It was a faded piece of fabric tied with old string. I tugged it out. Inside, there were scraps of paper, all covered in writing I didn't recognize. The letters looked strange, like a code or an ancient script. It also had small drawings of figures standing around a symbol similar to the one on the beam. My hands were shaking as I flipped through them. There were references to echoes and past voices. One line in English said, "They must be heard to be freed." Another said, "If you do nothing, you join them." That made my stomach clench. My breathing grew shallow. I was alone in that attic, crouching under a beam, reading these disturbing messages. I felt cold air on my arms. I heard a faint creaking from somewhere above me, though I couldn't see anything move. I set the bundle down and tried to calm myself. The air felt thick, like it was pressing on my chest. I picked up the bundle again and shoved it in my bag. I was determined to ask someone about this stuff, but I didn't know who. Later that night, the whispers came back stronger than ever. I turned off the light, laid on my bed, and stayed as still as I could. The voices sounded agitated. Some were almost hissing, others were sharp, like they were angry. I heard them say my name several times. They said, "He found it, and he must do it now." My heart was hammering, my breathing was fast, and sweat trickled down my forehead. I clenched my jaw, not sure what to do. I rolled over, switched on the light, and shouted, "What do you want from me?" But the instant I made noise, the voices vanished. My voice echoed in the cramped attic. I felt stupid shouting at nothing. My hands were shaking. My eyes were darting around the room, searching for any movement. I saw nothing, just the same peeling wallpaper and the same dirty window. I stayed up for hours, afraid to turn off the light again. The next day, I realized I couldn't keep living like that. My mind was frayed. I decided to confront those symbols head on. I climbed onto the chair and started scraping one of the carvings with a knife. The wood splintered under the blade, and a few shards fell to the floor. I kept going, ignoring how the attic seemed to get colder. My teeth were chattering. After a few minutes, I stopped. My chest was tight, and I felt a buzzing in my ears, almost like pressure building up. Then I noticed the voices again, but I was still moving. They were so loud that I could hear them even though I wasn't totally silent. They were disjointed, but it felt like they were screaming. I dropped the knife and stepped back, my head pounding. I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the attic, my footsteps echoing in the hallway. I stayed outside for a while, just breathing in fresh air. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. After I calmed down a bit, I went back in, not knowing what else to do. I couldn't afford another place. The boarding house was all I had. That night, I decided to set my phone to record audio while I tried to sleep. I placed it near the center of the attic, made sure it was fully charged, and hit record. I laid on the bed and tried to relax. The voices started up after a few minutes. I heard them mention my name repeatedly. They said something like, "He must break it," or "He must open it." It was always unclear. They also mentioned the bundle, called it the key. I felt my body trembling. My breath was unsteady, and I stayed perfectly still so I could record every word. In the morning, I played back the recording. I heard myself breathing, the bed creaking, and then faint whispers. I turned the volume all the way up. I could make out a few words: liberate, complete, and my name. I heard a phrase that sounded like, "We are echoes from before." My mouth went dry. Hearing it on the recording made it feel more real. I spent the day trying to interpret the clues I had, the strange symbols, the scraps of paper, the voices wanting me to do something. I understood that they wanted me to free them somehow. I also knew that if I did nothing, they might pull me in. I had no idea what that meant. By nightfall, I felt cornered. My body was tense, my shoulders ached, my mouth was dry. I couldn't keep living in that fear. I looked at the bundle of fabric I had found and remembered the lines. They must be heard to be freed, and if you do nothing, you join them. I stood under the beam with those strange carvings, turned off the light, and said, "I'm listening." The attic felt ice cold. My breath came out in shaky rasps. The voices erupted around me like they were pressing against my ears. They sounded furious at first, then desperate, then pleading. I nodded, not sure why, but I just felt like I had to respond. I said, "I accept," without knowing what I was accepting. The murmuring rose to a roar, then died down. I turned the light on. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I looked up at the beam. Most of those symbols were still there, except for the one I had scraped. I didn't know what to do next. The voices stayed silent after that. I stood there for a while, waiting for something else. Eventually, I got in bed, stared at the ceiling, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained. I heard no whispers. I checked the rafters. The symbols were the same. I took the bundle of papers and placed them on the small table. I felt a bit calmer, though I had no real explanation for any of this. All I knew was that the voices had quieted for now. and I still couldn't leave. I needed that cheap room. But I had the sense that something changed. Maybe I agreed to help them. Maybe I accidentally agreed to let them pull me in. I'm not sure. I just know that every now and then when I'm totally quiet, I still hear those voices. They're softer, like they're watching, waiting for me to act. And every time I see those symbols on the wood, my fingers buzz with that strange energy. I don't know what happens next, but I'm stuck in that attic until I figure it out or until I lose myself in the silence. For now, that's my life. And I can't afford to move anywhere else. I never expected to feel so on edge in a place I knew like the back of my hand. I've been a guide in these catacombs for 8 years. I used to walk through every tunnel with complete confidence. I knew which passages were blocked off, which turns led to water damage, and which halls never saw any visitors because they were too unstable. I wasn't scared of the dark corners or the damp smell. I always considered it a routine job, maybe a bit claustrophobic at times, but nothing serious. Now I'm not so sure. My hands shake when I think about going back down there. My throat gets tight and I keep looking behind me. I don't sleep well. I can still hear those sounds echoing in my head. I can still feel that rush of cold air brushing against my face when I least expect it. It's like something's breathing in the darkness. I can't shake the feeling that I've crossed a line and seen something I wasn't supposed to see. I started noticing strange things about a month ago. I was taking a small group through the usual tourist path, pointing out old carvings and explaining the history. I tried to keep it engaging. Then I heard what sounded like a faint scream somewhere off to my right. The group didn't react. I thought maybe it was my imagination or maybe a trick of the echo from a separate tour group. But the sound got louder in my head, like a muffled wail. My stomach tightened, and I forgot a few lines of my usual script. I took a moment to breathe and continued with the tour, but I couldn't ignore the sick feeling it gave me. After the tour ended, I walked back to that section by myself. I stood there, flashlight in hand, listening. I heard nothing. The air was stale, and the silence seemed to press in on my ears. I felt uneasy, but told myself it must have been a random echo. Still, I went home with a headache that night. I shrugged it off. During the following week, there were more odd moments. I'd step away from the group for a second, maybe to show them a specific inscription, and I'd feel a sudden gust of air on my back. The catacombs don't usually have strong drafts. The air is often still and musty. But this felt like a breeze from a tunnel opening, except there wasn't any new opening in that area. I'd look around, shining my flashlight in every corner, and see the same old walls, damp stone and cracks. No gap in the bricks, no new hole, nothing. Yet I felt the rush of air, cool on my skin, real as anything. I convinced myself there must be a narrow ventilation duct somewhere I hadn't noticed. I didn't want to think about it too hard, but the feeling was strong enough that I sometimes dropped my flashlight from the shock. My heart would race and I'd have to calm myself down by taking slow breaths. Then came the night I saw that passage. It was late. I'd stayed behind after the last tour, double-checking a back section of the catacombs for safety issues. We were scheduled for a larger group the next morning, so I wanted to make sure everything was stable. Most nights I feel fine in the tunnels, even when I'm alone. That night felt different. The light seemed dimmer, and my steps echoed with a hollow ring that made me tense up. My pulse throbbed in my neck. My eyes kept darting toward corners I normally never gave a second thought. I kept hearing faint shuffling noises behind me, like feet dragging on stone. I shone my flashlight over my shoulder more times than I want to admit, but I never saw anything. I was about to wrap up and head back to the main exit when my flashlight beam caught something unusual. It looked like a small archway on the left side of the corridor, in a spot that had always seemed like a solid wall. I'd never noticed any sign of an entrance there. The stone looked old, worn, and covered in dust, but the shape was clear. There was an opening maybe 3 feet wide, arching upward about 6 feet high. I stepped closer, heart racing, and wiped some of the grime away with my sleeve. Below the arch, I saw carvings in the stone. The words were in a language I didn't recognize except for a phrase that stood out. It said, "Labyrinth of the Repentant," in older lettering, like an ancient mix of Latin and something else. The rest of the symbols looked twisted with strange lines that circled back on themselves. The more I stared at them, the more I felt my vision blur. My hands got sweaty. My breathing got shallow. I thought I saw the lines shifting in the faint light, like they were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. I thought about leaving right then. It was late, and I was already uncomfortable, but my curiosity got the best of me. I stepped into the passage, holding my flashlight out in front. The temperature dropped almost instantly. My breath came out in soft clouds, and my lips felt numb. The walls were tight around my shoulders, but they seemed to widen as I went forward. I heard a low whisper near my ear, but I couldn't make out the words. The floor felt uneven under my boots. I tripped on a rock and nearly fell. My flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. I smelled damp moss and something sharp like sulfur. The space opened into a small chamber with more of those inscriptions on the walls. They all had the same style, curving lines that seemed to slither across the stone. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I noticed a door on the other side of the chamber. It was made of old wood reinforced with iron. The hinges looked rusted, but the door stood firm, as though it had never been touched. I pushed on it, and it gave a soft creak. A draft of air came through, cold enough to make my eyes water. I took a step back. Something about that door felt wrong. My chest felt heavy, and my stomach knotted. I thought about turning around right then, but I couldn't ignore the strange pull I felt, like a pressure behind my eyes that urged me to keep going. My flashlight flickered again. I took a deep breath and walked through that door, ignoring the tightness in my chest and the sweat on my neck. The corridor beyond was narrow, but the floor was smoother, almost polished. The walls had more of those unsettling symbols, all carved at eye level. I tried not to look too closely. My imagination kept playing tricks on me, and I swore I saw shapes shifting whenever my light flickered. The air smelled stale and cold, like a crypt that had been sealed for centuries. My ears caught a low humming noise like distant machinery, but it faded as soon as I tried to pinpoint its source. My throat felt raw, and the dryness in my mouth made me swallow hard. I kept moving forward, one step at a time. After about 10 steps, I heard a voice. It came from somewhere ahead, so faint I barely caught it at first. It sounded like a whisper carried by a breeze. I froze in place, pressing my back against the cold stone. My heart hammered as I turned off my flashlight for a moment to listen. I heard a murmur, something like, "Keep going." I felt a chill spread through my shoulders. I switched the flashlight back on and pointed it down the corridor. Empty. No movement, no figure, nothing. I told myself I was just jumpy. My mind was probably playing tricks on me because of the gloom, but I couldn't calm the tremor in my hands. I reached another chamber, bigger than the last. The ceiling arched overhead, dripping with moisture. The floor was dotted with shallow puddles. I stepped around them carefully, not wanting to slip. My flashlight caught a series of inscriptions on the far wall. They looked fresh, without the layer of grime I'd seen on the others. I stepped closer and saw the same phrase repeated, "Labyrinth of the Repentant." My spine tingled. The letters looked carved with a precision that didn't match the rest of the place. They were etched deep into the stone as though done recently. I didn't want to stand there anymore. My palms were slick with sweat. I felt exposed, like the shadows were watching me. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but that same pull in my head urged me forward, whispering that I needed to see what lay beyond. I found another door, similar to the first. This one was partly ajar. The space beyond was darker. I stepped through and felt like I'd crossed into a different part of the catacombs altogether. The walls were dark brown, moist, and the floor felt soft under my boots, like packed earth instead of stone. I heard dripping water and the faintest sound of something shifting far ahead, like a large body scraping against the tunnel walls. Every hair on my neck stood on end. My mouth went dry and I could hardly catch my breath. My thoughts were racing. I wondered if some huge creature had made its home down here. The idea of a wild animal in the catacombs didn't feel right. There were no signs of paw prints or any typical nesting spots, and it was too deep to be an ordinary animal anyway. My chest pounded, and sweat trickled down my back. I pressed on, shining my light along the walls. The inscriptions now looked different, larger, more spread out, as though carved by a different hand. The lines were thicker, and the shapes reminded me of contorted figures trapped in cages. But I couldn't look for long. My body tensed each time I focused on them, like they were pulling at my mind. I kept my gaze on the ground, trying to keep track of my steps. I felt a draft again, stronger this time, blowing from ahead. It brought a deep rumble, like an exhalation from something enormous. My ribs felt tight. My flashlight beam wavered with the trembling in my hand. Suddenly I heard that whisper behind me. I spun around, shining the light back the way I'd come. The corridor was empty. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. My stomach churned. I turned back to see if there was any sign of an exit, but the passage twisted away into darkness. No direct route back. I felt panic rising in my throat, and I forced myself to breathe in and out, thinking I might pass out if I kept freaking out. My steps felt slow and stiff as I inched forward. The floor was damp, and each footstep made a soft squelch. My clothes clung to my skin from the humid air and my own sweat. I couldn't believe I'd gone so far in. Everything around me felt hostile. The corridor ended in another chamber, circular this time, with a single pillar in the center. The pillar had those inscriptions swirling around it from top to bottom. I turned in a slow circle, shining the light on every inch of the walls. No visible exits. I stared at the pillar. My hands twitched. I felt like the room was breathing. There was a faint rhythmic movement in the air. My flashlight started to dim. I slapped it a few times and the beam steadied, though weaker than before. I approached the pillar, stepping around small piles of rubble and puddles. The inscriptions were as unsettling as before, but I tried to keep my eyes on them. I noticed a series of shallow grooves carved into the floor around the pillar, almost like a ring. I stepped over the ring and a vibration ran up through my legs. It felt like stepping onto a live wire. That's when the pillar started to glow faintly. It wasn't a bright light, more like a dull shimmer. I heard that same whisper, now all around me. My chest seized and my knees felt weak. I dropped my flashlight. It clattered on the ground, rolling away. I scrambled to pick it up, never taking my eyes off the pillar. The glow faded after a few seconds, leaving me in near darkness except for the flickering beam of my flashlight. I backed away, stumbling over the ring in the floor. My leg twitched and I bit my lip. A taste of copper flooded my mouth. The whisper got louder for a split second, then stopped. Everything went dead silent. My ears rang from the absence of sound. I don't know how long I stood there, breathing fast, feeling like my entire body was trembling. Finally, I forced myself to step back the way I came. I moved slowly, shining my flashlight on every inch of the walls to find the corridor. I expected the door to be right there, but it took me several minutes to realize the chamber must have shifted somehow. I traced my hand along the damp stone, searching for the opening. My heart hammered and I started to sweat more than ever. The wall felt solid. No door, no seam, nothing. I let out a shaky breath. My mind spun. I tried not to panic, but I felt claustrophobia tightening around me. I circled the room 2 or 3 times, running my hand across every surface. All stone, no gaps, no door. Eventually, I found a small crack in the far side of the room. I put my shoulder against it and pushed. It shifted, making a grinding noise. My heart lifted for a second. I shoved harder, and a piece of the wall slid open about a foot. I squeezed through, scraping my arms on the rough stone. My flashlight beam danced over a narrow tunnel. I followed it, feeling relief with every step away from that chamber. My breath rasped in my ears, and I just wanted to get out. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a passage I recognized. The old bricks and dripping ceiling told me I was near the main corridor we sometimes blocked off for safety reasons. I let out a sigh and rushed down the path, finally recognizing markers we'd placed on the walls. My boots kicked up dust as I pushed forward, ignoring the dull ache in my legs. I found the main corridor, then followed it to the exit. I broke into a near run. I didn't stop until I was outside, under the dim light of the lone security lamp near the entrance. I leaned against the cold stone exterior, chest heaving. My clothes were damp. My mind was a mess of images. Shifting walls, the glowing pillar, the whispers that seemed to come from every direction. I locked up and left without telling anyone what happened. I had no explanation. I didn't want to sound crazy, but the experience has stayed with me. Every time I close my eyes, I see those inscriptions dancing on the walls, twisting into shapes I can't describe. I hear that deep rumble like a giant breathing in the shadows. My pulse races and I feel a wave of nausea. I've tried to tell myself it's all in my head, but it doesn't help. I keep thinking about that phrase, labyrinth of the repentant. It's like it's carved into my thoughts, looping endlessly. Now each day I guide tourists, I avoid that section of the catacombs. I stick to well-lit tunnels and familiar rooms, but I can't ignore the sense that there's something else down there. The air feels charged like static before a storm. The walls seem closer than they used to. Sometimes I swear I see cracks in places that used to be smooth. My flashlight flickers now and then. I hear faint echoes of what might be distant footsteps. I pretend not to notice, but it sets my nerves on edge. I'm still trying to decide whether I'll ever go back to that hidden passage. Part of me wants to seal it up to make sure nobody else stumbles across it. But another part of me feels that strange pull again, urging me to return, to see what else lies deeper inside. I've stood at the entrance a few times after closing, gripping my flashlight, debating whether to push forward and confront whatever's there. Each time, my palms get sweaty, and my mouth goes dry. I picture that cold corridor and the heavy darkness pressing in on me, and I walk away. The catacombs used to feel like a second home. I knew every inch, every stone. Now I feel like I'm just a stranger walking through halls that watch me back. The silence is never just silence. The darkness never feels empty. There's always that faint sense that something is breathing, something is whispering, and I'm just one step away from hearing it again. I can't stop thinking about the possibility that I released something, or maybe I just woke it up. I keep telling myself to act normal at work, lead the tours, collect my paycheck and go home. But my nights are restless. I hear the screaming echo in my dreams, and I wake up in a sweat. I've started leaving my bedroom light on. I feel silly admitting that, but as soon as I turn the lights off, I imagine the darkness wrapping around me like those corridors. I can't handle the thought of hearing those whispers again. I also can't handle the idea that I might see the lines from the inscriptions crawling on my bedroom walls. Sometimes I stare at the ceiling, waiting for my eyes to adjust, half expecting to see shapes forming. My heart races and I have to remind myself I'm at home, not in those passages. Yet the memory of that cold air and those moving shadows never leaves. I've thought about quitting my job, but I need the income, and I'm not sure leaving would fix anything. The fear is in my head. The sense of being watched is always there. I haven't told my coworkers. They'd laugh or think I'm cracking under the stress of the job. Some might believe me, but I doubt it. The company that employs me wouldn't want rumors of something hidden in the catacombs scaring away tourists. So I keep it to myself. I show up, smile, and guide groups through the safe zones. I warn them not to wander off. Inside, I feel my stomach tighten every time someone takes a step too close to an uncharted tunnel. Tonight, I'm sitting at home, staring at my keys and thinking about the next shift. My hands shake a little. My pulse thuds in my temples. I can't stop replaying those moments. The breeze on my neck, the strange voice telling me to go deeper, and the feeling that something ancient waits behind those walls, eager to reach out and warp my mind. I feel sweat beading on my forehead. My legs feel restless, like I want to run but don't have anywhere to go. I'm torn between the urge to go back and the fear of losing my last grip on sanity if I do. I'm not sure how this will end, but I know something changed after I found that passage. The catacombs aren't just a job anymore. They're a place where something lives in the dark, whispering to anyone who wanders too far. My gut tells me it's some sort of trapped entity, locked away by ancient designs, waiting for the right moment to break free. The inscriptions call it the Labyrinth of the Repentant, but I don't see any sign of atonement down there. All I feel is dread. The next time I have a shift alone, I might be tempted to go back through that hidden archway, to see if the door is still there, to see if the symbols have changed. But deep down, I'm scared of what might happen to me if I give in to that pull again. I don't want to end up trapped in those shifting corridors listening to whispers I can't escape. For now, I'll try to keep my head down, stick to the guided paths, and hope whatever is down there stays locked behind that door. Because one thing is certain, something in those tunnels wants out, and I'm not sure I can hold on to my sanity if I face it again. I still remember the jolt in my chest the first time I heard my own name whispered in an empty hallway. I had just moved into this attached house a few weeks earlier, and I thought I knew every strange corner of the place. I was wrong. I never planned to live in a house with such a peculiar design. The real estate ad showed a standard layout, but I quickly noticed the unusual slope of the staircase and the cramped space underneath it. The agent said it was a storage area, nothing more. I didn't think much about it until I started cleaning and found that old tape recorder. When I first opened the door to that little compartment, I noticed a stale odor. It wasn't strong, but it made me wrinkle my nose. The space was small, barely big enough for a few boxes. It had a low ceiling and the light bulb flickered when I switched it on. The walls were rough with peeling paint and a few cobwebs. I saw a dusty stack of cardboard boxes in the corner. I dragged them into the hallway, hoping to toss out whatever junk the previous owner left behind. That's when I noticed a smaller box hidden behind the rest. It was an old shoebox with torn edges. I opened it and saw a tape recorder inside. It looked like something from decades ago, with large buttons and a heavy plastic casing. Next to it were several cassette tapes labeled with dates. I carried the box into the living room, set it on the coffee table, and sat on the couch. My plan was to throw it away if it didn't work, but I got curious and decided to see if the device still had any juice left. It didn't, so I rummaged around until I found an AC adapter in the same box. I plugged it in. The tape recorder made a soft click when I pressed the play button. At first I heard static and faint humming. Then a voice spoke. It was muffled and had that weird warbling you get with old recordings. October 12th, the person on the tape said. Footsteps in the hallway again. I heard them around midnight. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. I paused the tape, feeling a slight tension in my stomach. I glanced around my new living room. It was broad daylight, and the windows let in a lot of sun. Nothing felt strange at that moment, but the voice on the tape sounded serious. I breathed slowly and hit play again. The steps were heavy. They sounded like boots on the hardwood floor. I got up to check. Nobody was there, but I felt cold air near my face. I didn't like the idea of hearing about ghosts or weird footsteps in a house that was now mine. I switched off the recorder and decided to put everything back in the box. I planned to forget about it, or maybe listen to more of it when I felt braver. But an hour later, I found myself wondering about the rest of the tapes. Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed the next cassette from the shoebox. It was labeled with a different date. I popped it in, pressed play, and waited. The voice on this tape sounded different. It was deeper, almost panicked. November 3rd, it said. Door slammed in the middle of the night. I tried to open it, but it was locked from the inside. Then I heard my name coming from somewhere behind me. I felt a little shaky. I realized I was leaning forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the tape recorder. I pictured that scenario in my head. It sent a small chill through my arms. I rubbed my palms together, trying to calm myself. Then I heard a tapping noise. It came from the wall behind me. I froze and turned around. The wall looked solid. I stood up and walked over, pressing my ear to the plaster. Nothing. It was probably the house settling. Maybe the neighbor. It was a semi-detached property after all. The walls were shared, but the timing freaked me out. The tape talked about a door slamming, then I heard taps on the wall. I had an uneasy feeling, but I played the tape again. The deeper voice described something else. I keep hearing that same voice in the hallway. Last night it whispered, "Come here," but it sounded like it was right next to my ear. I pressed to stop and exhaled. My living room was quiet. I felt the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I heard a car drive by outside. Everything seemed normal. I told myself I was overreacting. I rewound the tape to see if I had missed anything. Then I noticed something else in the background, a faint thumping. It was softer than the voice, but it was there. My skin prickled. I switched off the recorder again and got up. I thought I might be scaring myself, so I decided to go outside for some fresh air. I stepped onto the front porch and leaned on the railing. The street was quiet. The neighbor's car was parked a few feet away. A cat wandered across the sidewalk. I stayed out there a while, just breathing and trying to steady my heart rate. I told myself these tapes were probably some old recordings from previous tenants or some personal project. Then I remembered the tapping on the wall. It had lined up too well with the tape. The thought kept swirling in my head. Later that evening, I ordered some takeout and ate in the dining room. I noticed how creaky the floors sounded, but I tried to ignore it. The house was older, after all. I had to accept that. After dinner, I felt restless. I wanted to check the rest of the tapes. I'm not sure why. Maybe I wanted to get it over with. I fetched the shoebox from the living room and took it up to my bedroom. I sat on my bed with a small lamp on. The rest of the room was dim. I held the recorder and the next tape labeled November 10th. When I pressed play, a new voice spoke. This one sounded female. I noticed the closet door was open again. I always keep it locked. Now it's wide open. I swear I locked it before bed. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the recording. Then she spoke again. There's tapping inside the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it keeps happening at random times. I paused the tape. The mention of tapping made my chest feel tight. A second later, I heard 3 quick knocks from somewhere downstairs. I jumped. My back tensed up. I didn't move for a few seconds. I waited, hoping I'd hear nothing else. The house was quiet after that. I was getting scared, but I still felt an urge to keep going. I let the tape play. The woman described hearing her name being called. She talked about waking up at 3 a.m. and seeing a shape at the foot of the bed. Her voice trembled, and it made me feel uneasy. Then she said, "It's calling me again. I can hear it right now." The tape ended with a click. I set the recorder down and tried to breathe normally. My bedroom suddenly felt colder. I checked the thermostat on the wall. It read 68 degrees, which was normal for that time of night. But my skin felt cold. I rubbed my arms and tried to think logically. Maybe the neighbors were making noise. Maybe these tapes were just old stories. But the knocks I heard matched the woman's description so closely. I grabbed another tape. This one had no date. I popped it in and the tape started right away, no introduction. I heard a voice whisper, "He's here." My heart thumped. The voice said it again, louder this time. "He's here." Then it spoke my name. It spoke it clearly, as if someone stood right behind me. I dropped the recorder on the bed and jumped up, nearly stumbling over the corner of the blanket. I looked around the room. I was alone. I stayed there, breathing fast. I picked up the recorder again, hands shaking. The tape kept playing. The voice said, "He just moved in. He doesn't know we've been following him." I felt my forehead grow damp with sweat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to stop listening, but I couldn't make myself do it. I needed to hear the rest. The voice continued, "He'll hear the knock soon. He'll hear his name. It's always the same sequence." Then I heard another person's voice in the background, like 2 or 3 people were talking at once. They said things I couldn't make out, except a few words like steps and walls. I bit down on my lower lip, trying to stay calm. The tape ended with static. I sat there in the dark bedroom, playing with the corner of the cassette, tapping it against my knee. I didn't like the feeling I had, as if the walls themselves were listening. I got up and turned on every light in my bedroom. I paced around, checking the closet, checking the hallway, checking under the bed. Everything looked normal. But I couldn't shake the idea that these recordings somehow described events right as they were happening. The next day, I told myself I'd ignore the tapes. I woke up, had coffee, and went about my errands. I did some grocery shopping, passed by the post office, then came home around lunchtime. As I walked through the front door, I felt a slight hesitation. The hallway felt different. It was quiet and still. I closed the door behind me. I heard a soft shuffle upstairs, like someone slid their feet across the floor. I turned the doorknob to the closet on my left, checking if anything was out of place. It was empty except for a broom and some cleaning supplies. I shut it and stood there in silence for a few seconds. I thought about the tapes again, especially the one that said, "He's here." I tried to remember the exact wording. It said something about following me for a long time. The idea that these voices had been tracking me before I moved here made my skin crawl. I'd never noticed anything odd in my old apartment, unless I just never paid attention. I couldn't rest. I went back to the little storage space under the stairs, wanting to see if I missed anything else. The light bulb flickered when I turned it on. The walls looked the same. Peeling paint, a few cobwebs, some scuff marks on the floor. I noticed a weird scratch pattern on one wall. It looked like long lines, maybe from something scraping against it. I ran my hand over it. The lines were shallow but irregular. I wondered if some piece of furniture had been dragged through there. I checked the corners using my phone flashlight to see if there was any hidden compartment. Nothing. I shook my head, feeling a wave of frustration. There had to be a logical explanation for all this. Maybe the previous tenants recorded these tapes as a prank or some kind of therapy. Still, the mention of my name was too specific. That afternoon, I decided to listen to each tape from start to finish. I sat in the living room, curtains drawn, lights on, and worked through them one by one, taking notes on a pad of paper. Most of the tapes featured different voices, both men and women, and they all described similar events: knocking, footsteps, voices calling their names. Some described cold spots or doors slamming. A few mentioned seeing shadows. The final tapes mentioned my name. Some referred to me by describing places I used to frequent, like my old coffee shop or my workplace. That detail made my throat go dry. As I listened, I felt an uncomfortable pressure in my chest. I'd pause the tape whenever I heard something I couldn't believe, like references to things I did before I moved into this house. I tried to recall if I'd seen anyone watching me at the old place. I thought about neighbors, co-workers, random people at the grocery store. None of it rang a bell. My notes were messy, half sentences and scribbled question marks. Around 7 p.m., I paused to grab a bite to eat. I went to the kitchen, fixed a sandwich, and leaned against the counter. I heard movement in the living room, a subtle shifting like someone brushing against the couch. When I went back to check, nothing looked disturbed, but the air felt heavy. I didn't hear anything else, so I sat down and forced myself to finish the last tape. It started with another voice I didn't recognize. Then I heard shuffling, like the recorder was being moved around. A person spoke my name again. Then he said, "He's listening to this right now." I stopped breathing for a second. Then I heard a faint click, like a door being opened on the recording. The voice continued, "Look behind you." I froze. My eyes darted around the living room. I felt my grip tighten on the recorder. I slowly turned my head and looked behind me. Nothing. Just the wall and the hallway leading to the kitchen. My hands were slick with sweat. I turned off the tape. I couldn't do it anymore. I sat there, heart pounding. I tried to focus on what to do next. I considered leaving the house, but I didn't know where else to go. I had just moved here, and I didn't want to run off just because of some creepy tapes. I paced around the living room. My legs felt jittery. Each step made the floor creak. I opened the curtains to let in the fading daylight. Outside, the street was empty. A neighbor's porch light was on. It made me feel a little less alone. That night, I went to bed with every light in the hallway on. I heard a few thumps here and there, but I didn't investigate. I stayed under the covers, staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. The next day, I explored every inch of the house. I checked the attic, the basement, even the crawl space under the back porch. I found nothing unusual except old dust and spider webs. I still live here. I keep the tapes in that shoebox in a closet upstairs. I haven't listened to them in a while. Sometimes I hear taps on the walls or weird footsteps at night. I don't investigate anymore. I try to ignore them. But I can't stop thinking about how those tapes knew so much about me. Sometimes I lie in bed, wondering if there are more tapes hidden somewhere, or if a new tape is being recorded right now, capturing everything I do. I haven't told anyone about it. I don't want to be labeled as the paranoid new guy who thinks his house is haunted. For now, I'm trying to stick it out. The knocks and creaks still happen. I still feel like someone's watching me sometimes. But I choose not to look deeper. I don't want to hear more predictions. I don't want to hear another voice call my name and match the exact second I'm standing in that same spot. That's all there is to say. I'm here, living with these tapes, these odd sounds, and this under-the-stairs space that still smells stale and flickers with that old light bulb. I wish I had never pressed play in the first place. But now, it's too late. If the tapes are right, there's more in store. The only question is whether I'll ever have the courage to listen again. I first heard the rumors about those caves when I was sitting in a small diner near the foothills. A local man mentioned strange echoes in one of the deeper caverns. He said the sound sometimes repeated parts of a person's speech, but not in the usual way an echo does. I remember how he leaned forward over his coffee cup and said, "That place isn't right." His face looked pale, like he'd seen or heard something that wouldn't let go. I felt a tightness in my chest just from the way he said it. Still, I wanted to see those caves for myself. I'm not big on superstition, and I never liked being scared off by vague warnings, but I can't deny I felt a spark of unease. Something about his eyes told me he wasn't making it up. The first time I approached the mountains, I parked my truck in a clearing. The air was cool and the slope looked steep ahead of me. I felt the crunch of gravel under my boots. I took a heavy flashlight in my backpack, which held some spare batteries, a bottle of water, and a basic first aid kit. My plan was simple: hike to the known entrance, see if I could find the rumored side passage where the echoes were supposed to be the strongest, and take a few pictures. I'm not a professional cave explorer or anything. I just like to check out places people consider strange. It's more of a hobby than anything else. But that day, as I stared at the dark opening in the rock, I had a sudden urge to turn around. The wind picked up a bit, and a few loose stones tumbled down the slope behind me. I felt my pulse quicken, but I told myself to keep moving. Inside the cave, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in short puffs. I shone my flashlight around and saw a tunnel that sloped downward. The walls were damp and stained with small patches of moss. Tiny droplets of water trickled from the ceiling. The sound of dripping water echoed in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Every step I took kicked up dust and bits of gravel. I kept moving forward, eyes scanning for any sign of an unusual chamber. After a while, I came to a spot where the tunnel forked into two directions. On the left was a narrower path with old wooden beams that looked like they'd been placed there ages ago to support the ceiling. On the right was a wider route that had a slight downward slope. I chose the narrower path first. The deeper I went, the stronger my sense of isolation became. The silence was so intense that my own heartbeat echoed in my ears. I noticed a faint breeze coming from somewhere ahead, which felt odd because I was deep underground. Then I noticed shapes on the walls. They were faint outlines of human-like figures, drawn in what looked like a reddish pigment. I brushed my fingers lightly across them. The pigment flaked slightly to the touch. At that moment, I realized these weren't just random lines. There was a pattern showing figures standing around a large shape that looked like a swirl or vortex. It was crude, but clear enough to tell it was important to whoever painted it. I kept my flashlight trained on the walls as I went further. The passage opened up into a larger chamber with a high ceiling. Stalactites hung overhead, and the floor was uneven with small jagged rocks. My footsteps echoed with a metallic ring. A chill ran down my spine when I spotted more drawings on the far wall. This time, they showed people pointing upward toward these weird, specter-like forms. I stepped closer, crouching low to avoid a low-hanging rock. The figures had long arms, and they were positioned in a way that suggested they hovered in the air. The human shapes below them were arranged in a circle, almost as if they were performing some kind of ritual or maybe just meeting those forms. I suddenly heard a whisper-like sound behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam only showed wet rock and the mouth of another passage behind me. My throat felt dry. The whisper had sounded almost like my own voice, but too faint to be sure. I stayed silent for a moment, listening. The dripping water continued. My heart thumped hard in my chest. I took a few steps back toward the tunnel, not fully ready to turn my back on the room. Then I heard it again, an echo, but it felt out of sync with my own movement. I muttered, "Hello?" My own voice bounced back to me, but it wasn't a normal echo. I heard something else layered under it, like a distorted attempt at repeating my word. I felt a shiver across my arms. My muscles tensed, and I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I walked closer to the wall with the drawings, shining the flashlight from one end to the other, searching for more detail. Near the bottom, I noticed a series of smaller figures leaving the main scene, heading towards something that looked like a bright shape, possibly the surface. Above them, the specter forms seemed to follow. The whisper returned, but this time it sounded like words I couldn't understand. It was like hearing someone speak a language you've never heard before in a very soft voice, right next to your ear. I whirled around, the flashlight beam scattering across rocks. Still no one there. I backed out of that chamber and hurried through the tunnel. By the time I reached the fork again, I was panting. My skin felt clammy and covered in goosebumps. I needed air, so I walked back out the way I came, nearly tripping on the uneven ground. A surge of relief hit me when I finally saw daylight again. On the surface, the wind felt colder than before. The sun hadn't moved much, so I figured I had only been down there for maybe an hour or two. My stomach churned, and I realized I hadn't eaten since morning. I hopped in my truck and drove back to the motel where I was staying. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that soft whisper. It was like it was gently repeating random syllables, trying to mimic my voice. Around 2 a.m, I got out of bed and sat by the small table in the corner of the room, trying to calm myself with slow breathing. I told myself maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, but I decided I needed better proof. If something was going on down there, I wanted to record it. The next day, I bought a small digital recorder. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had a decent microphone. I headed back to the cave around midday. A couple of hikers passed me on the trail, but they didn't seem to be heading for that specific cavern. I didn't warn them about anything. I just nodded and kept going. My hands felt sweaty, and I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. Part of me wanted to turn around and forget it, but the thought of letting that weird echo keep me up at night without trying to capture it felt worse. I entered the same tunnel, noticing that the temperature drop still felt dramatic. My breath looked thick in the flashlight beam. I made sure the recorder was turned on and clipped it to my jacket. I spoke a few words as I walked, describing the surroundings. My voice echoed softly off the walls. At first, everything was normal. I heard my footsteps, my breathing, and the drip of water. I reached the large chamber again, noticing the same paintings. This time I could see them more clearly. The red pigment formed the shapes of swirling lines above the specter forms. It looked like a chaotic scene, but I couldn't decipher the meaning. I turned in a full circle, shining my flashlight around. That's when the echo started again. I heard words that sounded like eyes or ice. The syllables were muffled, but it definitely wasn't just my own voice bouncing back. My hands tensed on the flashlight. I stayed quiet to see if it would continue. After a few seconds, a series of hushed sounds floated through the chamber. It was like a group of voices whispering at once. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I said, "Who's there?" My voice echoed, but it didn't match up perfectly with what came back. The whisper that returned sounded like a mixture of my words and something else. Eyes that see, in the dark. It was choppy and distant, but I caught enough to piece it together. I stepped back, nearly stumbling over a rock. My breathing got faster. I forced myself to hold still and keep the recorder running. Another phrase came a few seconds later, broken and hard to understand. It sounded like, "Beings follow each visitor." My stomach flipped. My legs felt weak. I slowly left the chamber, moving with short steps. The echoes continued, but they grew fainter as I inched away. They seemed to fade into static. I didn't dare speak again until I was back near the entrance. Once I saw the daylight, I ran the rest of the way out. My lungs burned from the sudden burst of effort. Outside, I snatched the recorder from my jacket and replayed the last few minutes. At first, I only heard my own voice and some random echoes. Then it came, faint but definitely there. Voices, fragmented words, eyes that see in the darkness, and beings that follow. I froze in the parking area, the recorder still playing in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest and I stared at the tree line like something might come crawling out. I had proof that I wasn't imagining it, but that didn't feel good. It felt horrifying because I couldn't explain it. That night in the motel, I tried playing the recording again with headphones. The voices were clearer on headphones, but they had this warbling effect. It reminded me of radio static mixed with breathy whispers. I felt goosebumps on my arms and a knot in my stomach. The worst part was that after I took the headphones off, I still heard a faint whisper in my ears. I sat on the edge of the bed, eyes locked on the recorder. I thought about driving home first thing in the morning, just leaving it all behind. But a part of me needed answers. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, like some bizarre acoustic phenomenon or maybe a trick of the wind. However, the mention of eyes watching in the dark, plus the images I saw on those walls, made me think there was more going on. The next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I'd be standing in line at the local grocery store and I'd hear a soft hiss behind me. I'd spin around, but no one was there. At night, I'd wake up to faint sounds in my motel room, like distant whispers calling my name. My appetite dropped and I noticed my hands shaking whenever I tried to eat. Even the daylight didn't help much. I'd be walking around outside, feeling the sun on my face, and that echo would still ring in my ears. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I grew paranoid, checking corners and expecting to see shadows that weren't there. I replayed the cave recording over and over, hoping to find some clue or a sign that it was just a hoax, but it always sounded the same. The words about eyes and beings repeated like a broken warning. One evening I sat in the truck, staring at the path that led back to the cave. I had two choices: go back in for a final look or leave. A rational part of me said to drive away and never return, but I couldn't push aside the feeling that something had marked me. It was like the cave had reached inside my head. The best way to break free, I thought, might be to face it directly. If I could force whatever it was to show itself, maybe I could prove it was just an echo or some weird trick. So here I am, sitting behind the wheel, the engine still running. My hands are sweating on the steering wheel. My heart feels like it's going to burst out of my chest. I can't keep living with this constant tension. Either I confirm there's nothing really there, or I encounter whatever it is and find a way to end it. I shut off the engine and grab my flashlight, a fresh set of batteries, the recorder, and a small handheld camcorder. I approach the mouth of the cave, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The smell of damp rock hits me again, and I start down the tunnel. My legs feel like they're made of lead. The dripping water echoes louder than before, or maybe my nerves are amplifying everything. I record every step, describing the path in a low voice, forcing myself to sound calm. I reach the large chamber, and the paintings are still there. The red pigment stands out in my flashlight beam. I speak into the recorder. I'm back. I want to know what you are. My voice shakes on the last word. I stand in silence for a long moment. My breath is ragged. The chamber stays quiet aside from the water dripping. Then I hear a small click in my headphones. This time I'm monitoring the recorder in real time. A faint voice breaks through. It's not an echo. It says something about seeing in the shadows. I can't catch it all. I swallow hard, feeling my pulse pound in my throat. My flashlight flickers. I tap it lightly, and it stabilizes. Then a breeze blows past me, colder than the rest of the air. It almost feels like something brushed against my arm. My shoulders tense and I spin around, shining the flashlight in every direction. Nothing moves. I feel dizzy. The whisper returns, forming words. We see you. My chest tightens, and for a second I can't catch my breath. My instincts scream at me to leave, but I manage to speak again. Why are you here? The reply doesn't come immediately, just a light static. Then, you carry us out. That phrase hits me like a punch in the gut. My mind races, remembering the paintings of those specters following the human figures to the surface. I think about the possibility that whatever's in here doesn't stay behind. That's when I drop the recorder. I grab it off the ground, but my hands are shaking so badly I can barely keep my grip. The fear is overwhelming. My heart thuds in my chest and my breathing feels shallow. Every nerve in my body tells me to run. Without another word, I stumble toward the tunnel. My foot slips on a loose rock and I catch myself on the wall, scraping my palm. The pain is sharp, and I feel warm blood trickle. I push forward, not caring about anything except getting out. The walk back to the surface feels longer than before. I keep expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but I only get more of those faint whispers echoing against the rock. They sound like laughter or faint chatter, but I can't make out exact words. Finally, I see the gray light of the entrance. It's late in the afternoon and the sun is behind the mountains, casting long shadows on the ground. I rush toward my truck and fling the door open, tossing my gear inside. My hands fumble with the keys and I drop them once before getting the engine started. My lungs burn with each breath and my entire body trembles. I tear out of that clearing, bouncing over the rough ground. Even as I drive away, I sense something lingering on me. My ears still pick up a soft hiss like a voice reminding me it's not done. Now I'm sitting in a different motel, a few towns over, trying to decide what to do. I can't deny that the whispers have followed me. I still hear them at night, especially when the room is quiet. They seem to get louder when I let myself think about the cave. I have no clue how to remove this sense of being watched. Sometimes, I feel a presence in the corner of my eye. Whenever I turn my head to check, it's gone. But the feeling remains. I'm jumpy and exhausted. Part of me thinks I should just keep running, keep driving until I'm across the country. Another part wonders if that even matters. Maybe whatever latched onto me can't be escaped by distance alone. I haven't made my final decision yet. The fear sits in my stomach like a stone. My nerves are shot, and I can't imagine going back into that cave alone. But if I don't, will I live with these echoes forever? Right now, I'm just staring at the recorder on the table. I'm trying to steady my breathing and clear my head. I don't know what happens next. All I know is that those warnings about eyes in the darkness feel very real, and I'm not sure if I can handle carrying them with me any longer. For now, I'm just sitting here, listening to the silence and bracing myself for the next whisper that I know is coming. I remember the day I arrived at the old castle. I had driven for hours on narrow roads, passing fields and small villages that looked quiet and untouched by modern life. The castle itself stood on a hill with tall, dark stone walls and narrow windows. Its presence made my stomach tighten. I felt drawn to it as soon as I got out of my car. The air around it felt heavy and cool, even though it was late summer. I wanted something different and unsettling, so I headed straight for the oldest wing of the castle to see if I could stay there. I had read about the place in a travel brochure that promised a unique medieval atmosphere. The woman at the reception desk raised an eyebrow when I insisted on staying in the oldest room, but she handed me a key without question. She told me I'd find the room at the end of a dark hallway on the second floor, near the spiral staircase. I carried my suitcase inside and followed her directions. The corridor felt dusty and smelled of old stone. The walls were lit by a few electric lights that cast weak yellow pools on the floor. Every step made a hollow sound against the old wood beneath the thin carpet. I could hear the wind outside rattling the small windows at the end of the hall. My chest felt tense, and I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I hadn't seen anything unusual. Finally, I found my door. It was a heavy wooden door with black iron hinges. The key screeched when I turned it. Inside, the room was small, with a four-poster bed, a wooden dresser, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A single window let in a faint glow, but it was mostly shadows in there. I dropped my suitcase and took a moment to breathe. The quiet felt unsettling. I switched on the one lamp in the room. Its light didn't do much except make the corners look darker. The walls were cold stone, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees compared to the hallway. I set my suitcase on the bed and opened the window to let in some fresh air. That's when I noticed how thick the walls were. The windowsill looked almost a foot deep, and the stones around it were rough. Outside, the sun was setting, and the sky was turning orange. The courtyard below was empty except for a few parked cars. I rubbed my arms to get rid of the chills. As the sun dipped below the castle walls, I noticed my shadow on the far wall. It seemed normal at first, just me standing there. Then I moved to close the window, and there was a brief delay before my shadow moved. I stopped and did the same motion again, but more slowly. I raised my hand. The shadow lifted its arm a split second later. My stomach knotted up. I told myself it might be the weird angle of the lamp or something about the light from outside. I tried to shake it off, but it felt strange. I pressed my hand against the wall and the shadow did the same, but I noticed it kind of jerked at the last moment, like it hesitated. I told myself I was just tired from the long drive. It was the first evening, and I had nothing else to do, so I wandered downstairs to see if there was some kind of dining area. I found a small dining hall in the newer wing. I took a seat near the corner and ordered a simple meal from the staff. They served me bread, soup, and a glass of water. There weren't many guests around. I overheard a couple in the distance, but they seemed preoccupied with their own business. The staff moved quietly, and the atmosphere felt subdued, almost somber. After I finished eating, I walked around the courtyard for a few minutes. The night sky was clear, and I saw a few bats flitting near the castle towers. The moonlight gave the place a faint silver glow. My footsteps on the cobblestones echoed in the empty space. I tried to calm my nerves by focusing on my breathing. Eventually, I headed back to my room. I switched off the lamp and slipped under the covers. I planned to get up early the next day to explore the nearby village and maybe learn more about the castle's history. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound made my heart pound. I heard the old wood beams creaking and the wind whistling through the windows. Finally, I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up feeling stiff. My back hurt from the old mattress, and I noticed the shadows under my eyes. I got dressed quickly and went downstairs. I asked the receptionist if there were any guided tours. She said there was one in the late morning, so I joined it. The tour guide was a local man in his 40s. He spoke about the castle's construction, the families who had lived there, and various renovations over the centuries. The group walked through the courtyard, the main hall, and then up into one of the towers. Nothing felt too strange until we reached a narrow room in the tower. It had large windows facing the surrounding countryside. The guide pointed out that this room used to be some sort of guard post. Then he casually mentioned a rumor about a living shadow that caused problems in one of the older sections of the castle. He smiled in a joking way, but I noticed my heart pounding. I asked him for more details, but he waved it off like local folklore. After the tour, I pulled him aside and asked him directly. He shrugged and said, There's a story about a shadow that doesn't match the person casting it. He said people claimed it belonged to a spirit or force trapped in the castle, waiting for a chance to escape. I asked him if it ever harmed anyone. He said there were no official records of injury or death, but a few guests over the years had left the castle earlier than planned, complaining that something felt off. He said the staff tried not to talk about it because it scared away business. When I got back to my room, I stared at the spot on the wall where I had noticed the delayed movement the day before. I felt my skin crawling. I stepped in front of the window and watched my shadow on the stone floor. I moved my arm in a slow circle. The shadow moved with me, but I noticed a split-second difference again. It was like a slight lag in a video call. My stomach felt tight, and I swore softly under my breath. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I walked around the castle grounds, took photos, and ate my meals in the dining area. At night, I read a book or scrolled through my phone. But every time I looked up, I felt like the shadow was out of sync. One afternoon, while I was in the corridor heading to my room, I saw my silhouette on the wall. It looked taller than me. At first, I thought the lighting angle was playing tricks, but as I walked, the shadow seemed to stretch itself. I stopped, but for a heartbeat, the shadow kept moving. That made me break into a cold sweat. I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't help testing it. I'd turn corners quickly, trying to catch it off guard. Sometimes it followed me normally. Other times it had that unsettling delay. It gave me a jolt of adrenaline every time. My hands would get clammy, and my legs felt weak. I struggled to eat much because my stomach was in knots. I asked the receptionist if anyone else had reported flickering lights or strange electrical issues. She said no. I didn't mention my shadow directly, but I think she sensed I was uneasy because she asked if everything was all right. I lied and said I was just tired. That evening, I decided to learn more. I walked down to a small tavern just outside the castle walls. It was a short walk through the gates and down a cobblestone path. Inside, the tavern was dimly lit, with a few local people sitting at the bar. I ordered a beer and tried to make conversation. Eventually, I found one older man who knew a bit about the castle legends. He said there was a story about a shadow that was once imprisoned in the fortress. He claimed that a long time ago, someone performed some kind of ritual to contain this entity. The shadow couldn't leave on its own, so it stayed trapped in the walls. According to him, it needed a host, or someone to bond with, to break free. He said visitors who stayed in certain rooms reported that their shadows didn't look or move quite right. I asked if there was a way to stop it. He shrugged, saying that some people said if you leave soon enough, it won't fully attach. Other people tried to confront it, but he didn't have details on how that went. He just told me to be careful. His tone was calm, but it made my heart race. I felt a chill across my shoulders. I finished my beer quickly and headed back to the castle. When I entered my room, I noticed the shadow right away. The lamp was on the nightstand, casting a strong outline of my form onto the wall. But the shape on the wall had broad shoulders, and the head looked slightly tilted even though I was standing straight. I raised my arms. The shadow lifted its arms more slowly and with a strange jerk at the top. I felt my scalp prickle. My mouth went dry. I moved around the room just to see if it would correct itself. It didn't. It followed me, but with those little hesitations and shifts. My heart thumped in my chest. I turned off the lamp and sat on the bed in the dark. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the shadow creeping along the walls, getting larger and more separate from me. My chest tightened and my arms felt tense. I got up and turned the lamp back on, then left the room. I walked down the halls, hoping to clear my head. The corridor was quiet and smelled like damp stone. My footsteps echoed. When I passed by a window, I saw my reflection in the glass. The shadow behind me looked heavier. I swung my arm. The reflection shadow took an extra second to catch up. I cursed under my breath and nearly tripped over my own feet. I went back to the front desk and asked the receptionist if there was another room available in a different wing. She said they were booked up for the night because a small tour group had arrived earlier that evening. She offered me a couch in the lobby if I felt uncomfortable. but I couldn't say yes to that without explaining why. I didn't want to sound crazy. I shook my head and thanked her, then returned to my room. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy. I had finally managed to sleep for a few hours after leaving the light on all night. My body felt achy. I decided I wasn't going to stay any longer. I started to pack my suitcase. As I moved around the room, I saw the shadow on the wall again. It had a distinct outline that didn't match my arms or shoulders. My hands shook, and my heart pounded. I grabbed my things and rushed down the stairs, ready to check out. At the reception desk, I handed back the key. The receptionist asked if everything was okay. I told her I had to leave for personal reasons. She looked at me with concern but didn't push for details. I walked outside into the courtyard. The air felt cool against my face. My legs were shaky, and my pulse was racing. I got to my car and tossed my suitcase in the back seat. Then I started the engine and pulled out, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. In the mirror, I saw the interior of the car and a hint of my outline in the back seat from the morning sun. My shadow looked normal at that moment, just a typical dark shape. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a small bit of relief. I kept my eyes on the road as I wound my way back down the hill toward the main highway. Halfway to the first town, I noticed the late morning sun was casting my shadow on the driver's side door. I glanced at it while turning the steering wheel. For a second, it looked like the shape had a slight delay again. My breath caught in my throat. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel and forced myself not to look directly at it. My eyes started to water from stress. I told myself I was just imagining things. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about an hour away. I parked, got out, and stretched. The sun was high in the sky. I stepped around the car and looked at my shadow on the pavement. It seemed to move with me perfectly now. I felt my breathing slow down just a bit. I went into the station, bought a bottle of water, and tried to steady my nerves. I looked at my reflection in the window. I saw the same exhausted face I always saw. The shape behind me looked normal too. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I thought about the old man in the tavern saying that if you leave soon enough, it won't fully attach. I was hoping I got out in time. The memory of the shadow hesitating and stretching stayed with me, though. Even as I drove away, I kept glancing at my side mirror, half expecting to see something out of place. I never saw anything definitive, but my body remained tense for days afterward. I haven't gone back to that castle. I don't plan on visiting again. Sometimes I think about how the local legend said the shadow wanted to escape by attaching itself to someone. It makes me uneasy. I haven't noticed any lingering oddities, but I still get anxious when I'm in a dimly lit room. Whenever I see my shadow stretch across a wall, I feel my heart skip a beat. I remember that half-second delay in the castle. I remember the shape that didn't line up with my real body. I remember that old man saying, "If you leave soon enough." And I remind myself that I left before it could do whatever it planned. I think I did anyway. Sometimes I check the mirror and watch my own outline move just to be sure. If it hesitates, I feel that same surge of panic. So far, though, it looks normal. I hope it stays that way. If it doesn't, I don't know what I'll do. But for now, I'm away from those stone walls and that dark corridor, and I'm trying to forget the moment my shadow fell out of sync. I can't erase it from my memory, but I can try to ignore it, and that's all I can do. I ripped out a section of the old drywall in the hallway one morning and saw dark shapes spreading along the corners of the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just moisture, maybe a sign of a leaky roof. But then I noticed these shapes had contours that reminded me of faces. The outlines looked like they had eyes and twisted mouths. I felt something in my gut tighten. I had been in this house for a few weeks trying to fix it up, but I hadn't seen anything that strange until that day. I tried to ignore it at first. The house is old, and old houses often have leaks. I had a bucket of joint compound by my feet. I remember tapping the lid nervously, listening to the hollow sound. Then I dragged a stepladder over to the corner and climbed up to inspect the damage. I reached out and pressed my fingertips against the wet plaster. It felt slick, and a faint odor of damp earth clung to my skin after I pulled my hand away. There was no obvious hole or crack. No sign of infiltration that I could easily patch. It just looked like water had seeped through the plaster in random patterns. Except the patterns didn't look random at all. I spent the rest of the day scraping off the old paint, applying sealant, and trying to force myself not to stare at those shapes. Every time I glanced back, I felt like they changed a bit. It's hard to explain, but I kept seeing new angles, like new curves forming. The shapes weren't moving in a normal sense. It was more like I'd leave for 10 minutes and then come back, and the smudges had shifted into different outlines. When I finished for the day, I wiped the sweat off my forehead and went to bed in the makeshift bedroom I'd set up. I tried to convince myself I'd deal with it in the morning. That night I dreamed of people pressed against walls. They weren't screaming, but their mouths were open. They were inside the walls, struggling, their arms bending in strange angles as if they were pushing through a layer of thick, wet material. I woke up gasping for air, and my skin felt damp. I blinked and realized I wasn't sweating because it was hot. I was sweating because I was terrified. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I sat up in bed, stared at the dark outline of the bedroom door, and listened to the silence. The quiet felt heavy. I heard the faint drip of water somewhere behind the walls. I got up, turned on the small flashlight I kept on the nightstand, and walked to the hallway. I aimed the light at the ceiling. The shapes were still there, but I noticed some fresh outlines near the edges. I lifted a hand to my mouth. My fingertips trembled. They looked like new faces. I stood there for a minute, breathing through my nose, fighting the urge to run out of the house. I finally went back to bed but kept the flashlight next to me in case I needed to look again. Over the next few days I tried standard fixes. I bought new plaster, tried mold-resistant paint, and checked the gutters outside. I climbed up on the roof with a flashlight in broad daylight. I inspected every inch, felt around for soft spots, and found nothing. No holes, no broken shingles, no visible cause for the persistent moisture. Yet inside, the shapes kept returning. Sometimes they'd appear in corners I'd already repaired. I'd look up and see another faint outline like a new mouth or eyes. I started feeling a constant tension in my stomach. My breathing got shallow whenever I walked through the hallway. My hands shook when I worked. I called a local contractor to see if maybe the foundation was leaking from below. He came by, walked around, examined the place, and shrugged. He told me he couldn't see any big structural issues. No cracked pipes or obvious water damage from the plumbing. He said the house just seemed old. Maybe the humidity was higher than usual, or maybe I needed better insulation. I thanked him and paid him for the visit, but I felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening here. At night, my dreams got worse. I'd see these figures in a murky room. They looked soaked, their clothes sticking to their bodies. Their eyes were wide, as if they were desperate. They would extend their arms toward me, and I'd see water dripping from their fingers. Sometimes I'd hear faint voices, but never actual words. Just this muffled whispering noise that made me wake up with a tight chest and sweaty hairline. One evening I decided I'd look into the house's history. I drove to the local records office in town. It was in the basement of an old municipal building. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I flipped through property deeds and old documents in a cramped reading room. I found references to some unusual events from decades ago. There was a note about a group that used to own a nearby property. They had built underground tanks for something called purification rites. The record was vague. It didn't detail what those rites were, but I saw references to water, submersion, and ceremonies that took place beneath the ground. I felt my back tighten as I read. I rubbed my eyes and kept scrolling through the microfilm, looking for anything else that might explain the strange moisture in my house. One old news article mentioned a rumor of people hearing strange sounds near old wells in the area. Another piece described a local rumor about an abandoned meeting place where a group practiced secret rituals involving water. No mention of actual injuries or anything like that. Just stories about folks hearing odd chanting sounds at night, then noticing unusual damp spots in their homes the next morning. I stayed until closing time, gathering as much information as I could. I left with a handful of printed records and a spinning mind. Driving back, I kept tapping my fingers on the steering wheel. I wanted to believe it was all folklore, but the shapes on my ceiling didn't feel like random mold patterns anymore. They felt alive. When I got home, I went straight to the hallway. I didn't even bother turning on the main lights. I used a small flashlight again and aimed it at the corners of the ceiling. The black smudges looked more defined. I saw what resembled two large eyes, side by side, and a line below them that might have been a mouth. My neck felt stiff. I turned off the flashlight and then turned on the overhead light, hoping that the normal illumination would make it look less threatening. But it looked worse. The outlines were so clear that I stepped back involuntarily and bumped into the wall behind me. I could smell damp plaster. I could feel the moisture in the air. I breathed in and out, trying to stay calm. I decided I'd check the basement. I'd only glanced down there a couple of times, but I'd never really explored it. I figured maybe there was a hidden cistern or some old water tank. So I grabbed a heavy flashlight, a hammer, just in case I needed to pry something open, and headed down the narrow stairs. The basement was cold. The air felt stagnant, and I caught a whiff of mold. There were old boxes piled in one corner, and the floor was made of rough concrete. I tapped the walls with the hammer, listening for hollow spaces. Most of it sounded solid, except for one section in the far corner. I gave it a few more taps and heard a slight echo. My heart started pounding again. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the wall. I heard a faint dripping sound on the other side. I took the hammer and pried at the old wooden panel covering that section. After a few tries, the panel gave way, and I saw a small opening about 2 feet wide. Inside, there was a short tunnel or passage. It was barely tall enough for me to crawl through. I aimed the flashlight and saw a wet stone floor. I squatted down, feeling my knees tremble a bit, and shuffled inside. The air was colder and smelled like old water. My flashlight beam revealed damp walls with streaks of algae or mold. I followed the passage for maybe 10 or 15 feet. Then it opened into a small chamber. There was a round stone pit in the center, filled with dark water. I walked around the perimeter, shining my light on the walls. I saw carved markings, lines that might have been symbols, but they were eroded. I leaned in closer. The stone felt cold and slick. I noticed areas that looked like they had been chiseled into shapes, maybe some kind of pattern, but it was hard to tell. The pit itself looked deep. I squatted down at the edge, pointed my flashlight into the water, and saw my reflection. My face looked pale and tense. I took a deep breath. The water was dark, and I couldn't see the bottom. I stayed like that for a minute, just listening. I heard a faint dripping sound echoing through the chamber. My pulse thumped in my ears. I tried to imagine people gathered in this small underground room for some kind of ritual. The thought made me uneasy. I felt a tightness in my throat. I decided I didn't want to be there anymore. I backed away, turned around, and hurried back through the tunnel. My knees ached from the crouching, and my palms were clammy. I slipped once on the wet stone, but caught myself. When I reached the basement again, I took a big gulp of air as if I'd been holding my breath the entire time. I climbed the stairs as fast as I could without running. Back on the first floor, I sat down at the kitchen table. My hands shook. I stared at them for a minute, trying to steady my breathing. The house felt too quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, but it did nothing to calm me down. I thought about what I'd seen in the basement, that hidden chamber, the dark water pit, the weird symbols. I remembered the old records about a sect that practiced water purification rituals. My heart pounded faster. I looked at the ceiling above me, half expecting to see a face forming right there. After a while, I grabbed my phone and looked up more local history. I found references to stories about underground tanks in older properties. Some were connected to rumored gatherings that involved submerging volunteers in water to cleanse them of impurities. They believed water could trap certain energies, and they liked building these hidden basins. I also saw a few brief mentions of people hearing whispers through walls and houses near those old sites. My mind raced, and I shut off my phone screen because reading more just made me anxious. I wanted to leave the house. Part of me felt that staying was a mistake. But I had already invested my money in this place, and I felt this compulsion to figure out what was happening. I wanted a rational explanation. I got up and walked to the hallway again, looking at the wet corners on the ceiling. The shapes seemed even more pronounced than before. I tilted my head back and stared for a few seconds. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed the distinct shape of an open mouth. It seemed to be pointed toward me, like it was trying to speak. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. I took a step back, then another. My shoes squeaked on the floor. I heard a soft dripping noise above me. A drop of water landed on my shoulder. I jumped and brushed it off, then touched the spot with my fingertips. It left a dark stain on my sleeve. It smelled damp like the basement. My chest felt tight, and my legs felt weak. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening for any sound. I heard faint creaks in the walls, the usual house-settling noises, but they felt magnified by my imagination. My eyes darted around the room. The plaster on the ceiling was newly painted, so I didn't see any faces in here. But I couldn't stop picturing those shapes in the hallway and that water pit underground. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw those dream figures writhing inside the walls, arms pressed against the plaster. The next morning, I went outside to clear my head. The sun was out. The air felt cool on my skin, and I took a long breath. Then I stepped back inside, feeling a sudden chill in the entryway. I walked to the hallway, determined to see if things looked any different in daylight. The shapes were still there, and they appeared clearer in the bright light. The moisture glistened. The lines of what looked like eyes and mouths stood out. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to look. I wanted to see if they would move while I watched. They didn't move in any obvious way, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was shifting within them, like a slow, silent transformation. I knelt down by the wall, placed my hand on the floor, and felt a slight vibration. It might have just been my own body trembling. I stayed like that, breathing slowly, trying to decide my next step. The documents I found suggested something was sealed down there, something to do with that water pit. Or maybe it was just an old ritual site. But I couldn't ignore the way the walls seemed damp, the way those shapes looked like faces, or the fact that my dreams were filled with images of people trapped in water. I took some photos with my phone. I planned to show them to someone at the Historical Society or maybe a building inspector. My fingers felt unsteady. I kept wiping the phone screen because it got streaked with sweat from my hand. The idea of letting other people see this made me nervous. Would anyone believe me if I said the shapes kept changing? Would they just say it's mold or that I'm overreacting? Maybe they'd say I need a psychologist, but I needed to do something. So I sat down at the table again, phone in hand, flipping through the photos. The faces were visible, but not as obvious as they were in person. I sighed. My throat felt dry. I decided I'd invite a local historian over to take a look at the basement chamber. Maybe they'd have more clues about the group that once operated around here. Maybe they'd know how to handle weird underground structures. But right now, I'm still here in the kitchen, glancing at the hallway every few minutes. The house feels tense. The air is thick and my skin prickles when I think about what's beneath the floor. I can't stop imagining that stone pit and the water that never seems to dry up. I picture those dreamlike figures submerged, their eyes wide, reaching out through the damp walls of my house, trying to make themselves heard. I don't know exactly what happened here in the past. I just know that every day those dark spots on the ceiling keep changing. The shapes get clearer. The house feels more humid even though there's no logical reason for it. My breathing becomes shallow whenever I pass that corner in the hallway. My mouth tastes like copper when I think about going back down into the basement tunnel. And every night I wake up shaking, convinced that I can hear those silent whispers coming through the walls. I'm not sure how long I can stay here. But for now, I'm still inside this house, trying to figure out what to do next. I keep telling myself it's just mold and water. Then I remember that hidden chamber, the pit of dark water, and the stories I've read about a group that performed purification rituals underground. Maybe that's all it is, just old water that never drained properly. Or maybe it's something else that's still stirring behind these walls, desperate to be free. I feel the tension in my stomach every time I think about it, and every time I look up at the ceiling, I swear those faces are staring back at me.